In 1990, a French journalist asked 80-year-old Emil Cioran what he thought about when he woke up in the morning. Cioran smiled and said, "I regret that I wasn't stillborn." The journalist laughed nervously. Cioran wasn't joking. This is a man who spent 70 years writing about why being born is the worst thing that can happen to anyone, who called consciousness a terminal illness, who said the only serious philosophical question is why we don't all commit suicide immediately, who described hope as a criminal offense against reality. And yet people can't stop reading him. His books have been translated into 40 languages. There's a reason someone called him the most honest writer who ever lived, and someone else called him philosophically dangerous. Because once you read Cioran, something breaks. You can't unhear his voice. You can't unsee what he shows you. What makes Cioran different from other pessimistic philosophers is that he wasn't theorizing. He was reporting from a specific location, the sleepless nights that dominated his existence from age 14 onward. This wasn't occasional insomnia. It was chronic, relentless, lasting for decades. He would stay awake for days at a time, entire weeks with perhaps 4 or 5 hours of sleep total. His mind never stopped, never rested, never allowed him the mercy of unconsciousness. Most people in that condition would collapse into madness. Cioran transformed it into a philosophical method. He discovered that at 3 in the morning, when exhaustion has stripped away every psychological defense, when you've been awake so long that the normal mechanisms of self-deception fail, you see existence differently. The comfortable narratives dissolve, the consoling illusions evaporate. What remains is consciousness confronting itself without mediation. He began writing down what he saw in those hours. The results were devastating. It is not worth the bother of killing yourself, since you always kill yourself too late. This is not despair speaking. It is precision. A thought compressed until nothing unnecessary remains. The fact that life has no meaning is a reason to live, moreover, the only one. The paradox is genuine, not rhetorical. Cioran meant exactly what he said. I'm simply an accident. Why take it all so seriously? The question contains its own answer. We take existence seriously because we cannot help it, even though the seriousness itself is absurd. These are not philosophical arguments built through careful reasoning. They are observations delivered with surgical precision. You encounter them and something shifts in your understanding. The effect is immediate and irreversible. The disturbing thing about Cioran is that his writing is beautiful. He didn't produce his philosophy in the manner of someone ranting about the meaninglessness of existence. He wrote like a master craftsman, choosing every word with absolute care, revising each sentence dozens of times until it achieved formal perfection. A single paragraph might take an entire day. A page might require weeks of work. What emerged from this process was prose polished to an almost unbearable clarity. The sentences are sharp enough to cut. The thoughts are compressed until they achieve maximum density. His books are thin because he eliminated everything that wasn't essential. What remains is pure philosophical distillate. The strangeness is that readers find this comforting. Thousands of people claim that Cioran saved their lives, not by offering hope, he had none to offer, but by articulating what they had felt but couldn't express, by proving that someone else had experienced the same fundamental horror and survived it, by being honest when everyone else was lying. A cult has formed around his work, not an organized movement, but a distributed network of readers who recognize each other through certain signs. They quote his sentences to friends in crisis. They return to his books during their own sleepless nights. For a philosopher who despised humanity, Cioran has inspired remarkable devotion. Emil Cioran was born on April 8, 1911 in Rasinari, a small village in Transylvania, then part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. His father was an Orthodox priest. The landscape of his childhood was rural, mountainous, isolated. Transylvania at that time existed on the periphery of European consciousness, a region caught between empires, between East and West, neither fully modern nor entirely traditional. This geographic and cultural in-between would mark everything Cioran later wrote. His early years were unremarkable. He attended the local school where his father taught religion. The family was not wealthy, but they were educated, part of the village's small intellectual class. In 1920, Transylvania became part of Greater Romania following the First World War. Cioran was 9 years old. The village remained the same, but the maps had changed. At 17, Cioran moved to Bucharest to study philosophy at the university. The shift from village to capital was absolute. Bucharest in the late 1920s was attempting to remake itself as a little Paris, a city of cafes and boulevards, of intellectuals and artists, of men in European suits discussing European ideas. Cioran arrived as a provincial teenager and within months was drowning in books, arguments, insomnia. The insomnia began in 1925 or 1926. He was 14 or 15. It was not occasional sleeplessness, but something chronic and total. Night after night, he lay awake until dawn, his mind racing, his body exhausted. He would later describe these years as the most important of his life. Everything he wrote, every position he took, every refusal he made originated in those sleepless nights. The experience was not metaphorical. It was physical, relentless, maddening. He wandered Bucharest at 3 in the morning, sat in empty parks, watched the city sleep while he could not. In his early 20s, Cioran wrote his first book. It was called On the Heights of Despair, and he wrote it in a kind of fever, in cafes and rented rooms, in a state that oscillated between exaltation and collapse. The book was published in 1934 when he was 23. It won a prize. It was reviewed. But Cioran had already moved past it. He was writing constantly, essays and fragments, pouring out his thoughts on death, boredom, God, history, civilization. The tone was apocalyptic, the style was ecstatic. He became known in Romanian intellectual circles as brilliant, extreme, possibly unhinged. During these years, Cioran also became involved with the Iron Guard, a Romanian fascist movement that combined nationalism, mysticism, and violence. His involvement was not organizational. He did not march or recruit, but he wrote articles and letters expressing sympathy for the movement's critique of liberalism, its emphasis on sacrifice, its promise of national regeneration. He was young, angry, intoxicated by the idea of historical transformation. He wanted Romania to matter, to escape its status as a minor nation on the edge of Europe. The Iron Guard seemed to offer intensity, purpose, a break with the mediocrity he despised. This period lasted from roughly 1933 to 1940. It was the most shameful episode of his life, and he spent the next 50 years trying to bury it. He never wrote about it directly in his published work. When asked, he deflected, minimized, or refused to answer. The letters and articles he wrote during this time were not reprinted. He wanted them forgotten. But they existed, they were documented, and they revealed a young man capable of supporting a movement that would later murder thousands. By 1937, Cioran had left Romania. He received a scholarship to study in Paris, and he took it. He was 26. He intended to stay for a year, maybe 2. He never returned to live in Romania again. Paris in the late 1930s was still the center of European intellectual life, though the center was already crumbling. War was coming, refugees were arriving. Cioran lived in a cheap hotel room, attended lectures, haunted libraries. He had almost no money. He survived on the scholarship, on occasional translations, on the generosity of friends. The decision to stay in France was not sudden. It unfolded across years. Romania entered the war. The Iron Guard came to power briefly, then was crushed. Cioran's friends were killed or imprisoned or fled. Returning became impossible, then undesirable, then unthinkable. By the time the war ended in 1945, Cioran had been in Paris for 8 years. He was 34. He had written several books in Romanian. But he had begun to feel that Romanian was a dead end, a language without a future, the language of a small, defeated country no one cared about. In 1947, at the age of 36, Cioran made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He stopped writing in Romanian and began writing in French. The shift was not natural. French was his third language after Romanian and German. He had studied it in school, but he was not fluent, not comfortable, not confident. For months he struggled. His sentences were stiff, his vocabulary limited. He rewrote endlessly. He read French authors obsessively, trying to absorb the rhythms and textures of the language. He felt like a beginner, like someone learning to walk again. The first book he wrote in French was called A Short History of Decay. It took him years to write. It was published in 1949. The style was compressed, aphoristic, violent. Every sentence had been worked over dozens of times. The book was noticed. It won a prize. Cioran was now a French writer, or at least a writer who wrote in French. He would never write in Romanian again except in private notebooks. For the next 40 years, Cioran lived in Paris in near total obscurity. He never held an academic position. He never gave lectures. He never appeared on television. He lived with his partner Simone Bou in a small apartment on Rue de l'Odéon near the Luxembourg Gardens. They had almost no money. Cioran wrote in cafes or at home, published a book every few years, gave occasional interviews to small journals. He refused honors, declined invitations, avoided publicity. He became known as a kind of phantom, a writer people talked about but rarely met. His daily routine was rigid. He woke late, walked for hours through Paris, sat in cafes writing in notebooks, returned home in the evening. He had no telephone for most of his life. He saw a small circle of friends, mostly other Romanian exiles, other writers, other people living on the margins. He read constantly, everything from the mystics to the newspapers, but he never owned many books. He preferred libraries. The books he published in French were slim, elegant, despairing. The Temptation to Exist, The Fall into Time, The Trouble with Being Born, Drawn and Quartered. They sold modestly. They were reviewed in literary journals. A small audience formed, readers who returned to his books again and again, who found in his voice something they could not find elsewhere. But he was never famous. He was never best-selling. He remained marginal by choice and by circumstance. By the 1970s and 1980s, a cult had formed around his work. Students read him, intellectuals quoted him, journalists sought him out. He granted interviews reluctantly. He repeated the same themes, the same refusals, the same negations. He said he regretted being born. He said writing was a sickness, a way of making insomnia bearable. He said he believed in nothing. He said these things calmly, without drama, as if reporting the weather. In the early 1990s, Cioran began to lose his memory. It was Alzheimer's disease, though the diagnosis took time. He, who had spent 70 years thinking, writing, dissecting consciousness, now watched his mind dissolve. He stopped writing. He stopped reading. He forgot names, then words, then who he was. Simone cared for him until she could not, and then he was moved to a hospital. He died on June 20th, 1995, at the age of 84. He was buried in the Montparnasse Cemetery in Paris, far from the Transylvanian village where he was born. The Catastrophe of Birth, Existence as Trauma. Cioran's philosophy begins with a single claim that everything else follows from. Being born is a disaster, not a misfortune, not a difficulty, but an absolute catastrophe from which there is no recovery. This is not metaphor. This is not exaggeration. For Cioran, birth is the original violence, the first and worst thing that happens to anyone. The claim sounds absurd when stated plainly. Most people do not experience their own birth as a problem. Most people, if they think about it at all, think of birth as neutral or even positive, the beginning of possibility. Cioran reverses this completely. Birth is not the beginning of possibility. It is the beginning of suffering, limitation, decay, and death. To be born is to be thrown into a condition you did not choose, in a body you did not design, in a world you did not make. You are given existence without being asked, and once you have it, you cannot give it back except through death. Cioran returns to this theme across all his books. In The Trouble with Being Born, published in 1973, he writes that not being born is the ideal state. It is the only state free from suffering. But since we are born, we spend our lives trying to undo that fact, trying to return to the peace of non-existence. This is what all human activity is, underneath. We build civilizations, we create art, we seek pleasure, we pursue knowledge, but all of it is an attempt to forget or escape the fact that we exist. The idea has roots in several traditions. In Christianity, there is the doctrine of original sin, the idea that humans are born fallen, born guilty. But Cioran removes the theology. There is no sin, no God, no redemption. There is only the brute fact of existence and the suffering that comes with it. In Buddhism, there is the teaching that life is dukkha, suffering or unsatisfactoriness, and that the goal is to escape the cycle of rebirth. Cioran is closer to this, though he has no interest in the spiritual practices Buddhism offers. He simply agrees with the diagnosis. Existence is suffering. Not being born would be better. In Gnosticism, there is the idea that the material world is a prison created by a false or evil god, and that the spirit is trapped in matter. Cioran read the Gnostics and felt an immediate affinity. He liked their hatred of the world, their refusal to accept creation as good. But again, he strips away the metaphysics. There is no evil demiurge, no divine spark to be liberated. There is only the body, heavy and mortal, and the consciousness trapped inside it. What makes Cioran's position distinctive is that he does not offer a way out. He does not tell you to pray, to meditate, to revolt, to hope. He simply describes the situation and leaves you in it. Being born is a catastrophe. You cannot undo it. You will suffer. You will age. You will die. This is the truth. Everything else is distraction or delusion. The body is central to this. For Cioran, the body is not a neutral fact. It is a prison, a source of constant humiliation. You are hungry, so you must eat. You are tired, so you must sleep. You are sexual, so you are driven by desires you did not choose. The body has its own logic, its own demands, and you are forced to obey. Consciousness does not control the body. Consciousness is something that happens inside the body, subject to its rhythms and failures. Cioran also insists that consciousness makes everything worse. If humans were simply bodies, like animals, existence might be bearable. Animals do not question their existence. They do not lie awake wondering why they were born. They simply live, driven by instinct without reflection. But humans have consciousness, and consciousness turns existence into a problem. You are aware that you exist. You are aware that you will die. You are aware that nothing you do will ultimately matter. This awareness does not liberate you, it torments you. This is why Cioran envies animals. He writes about this repeatedly. Animals live in the present. They do not remember the past with regret. They do not fear the future. They do not ask why. A dog does not wonder if it should have been born. A bird does not lie awake contemplating death. Only humans do this. Only humans have the curse of self-awareness. The catastrophe of birth also has a temporal dimension. Once you are born, you are in time. You are subject to duration, to aging, to the slow disintegration of everything you are. Time is not neutral. It is not a container in which events happen. Time is decay. Every moment you exist, you are closer to death. Every experience you have is already in the past, already lost. You cannot hold on to anything. The present dissolves as soon as you notice it. Cioran does not romanticize childhood. He does not think there was ever a time when existence was good and then it went wrong. From the very beginning, from birth, you are in the catastrophe. Childhood is simply the period when you have not yet realized it. You are distracted by play, by novelty, by the illusions adults construct for you. But eventually you wake up, you realize what has happened, and then you spend the rest of your life trying to cope with that realization. The question then becomes, if being born is a catastrophe, why do people continue to have children? Why does reproduction continue? Cioran finds this baffling and obscene. People create new life knowing that life is suffering, knowing that every child will age and die, knowing that consciousness will torture them. And yet they do it anyway. They call it love. They call it hope. Cioran calls it cruelty. He does not argue for antinatalism as a political program. He does not campaign to stop reproduction. He simply observes it with a kind of horrified fascination. The fact that life continues, that people keep being born, that the catastrophe repeats itself generation after generation, strikes him as the ultimate proof of humanity's blindness. There is no solution in Cioran's philosophy. He does not say that realizing the catastrophe of birth will lead to liberation or peace. It will not. It will only lead to a clearer vision of the horror, and you will still be alive. You will still be in the body. You will still be in time. The catastrophe does not end because you understand it. This is what makes Cioran difficult to dismiss as simply depressed or nihilistic. He is not arguing from personal unhappiness. He is making a claim about the structure of existence itself. Being born means being subject to suffering, time, death, and consciousness. These are not accidents. They are the conditions of being alive, and once you see this clearly, you cannot unsee it. Insomnia as method, the philosophy of 3 a.m. Insomnia was not a theme for Cioran. It was the foundation. Everything he wrote came out of sleeplessness. Everything he thought was shaped by the experience of lying awake while the world slept. This was not metaphor. This was his life. The insomnia began when he was 14 or 15 in the mid-1920s. It was sudden and total. One night he could not sleep, then another night. Then it became chronic. For years he barely slept at all. He would lie in bed for hours, his mind racing, his body exhausted. When he did sleep, it was shallow and broken. He woke feeling worse than when he went to bed. This was not ordinary tiredness. It was a kind of disintegration. Sleep is what allows the mind to rest, to reset, to stop. Without sleep, there is no stopping. Consciousness continues uninterrupted, hour after hour, thought after thought, with no relief. Cioran described it as being trapped inside his own head, unable to escape, unable to turn off the noise. During those years in Bucharest, he wandered the streets at night. The city was empty, the cafes were closed. He walked alone through parks and along boulevards, watching the windows of apartments where people slept. He felt like a ghost, like someone who had fallen out of the normal rhythm of life. Everyone else moved between waking and sleeping, between day and night. He was stuck in a permanent waking, a permanent night. Insomnia became his method because it stripped away everything inessential. During the day, people are distracted. They are busy with work, with social obligations, with the machinery of normal life. They do not have time to think clearly. They do not have time to face the real questions. But at 3 a.m, alone, exhausted, with nothing to do and nowhere to go, all distractions fall away. You are left with yourself and the silence and the thoughts you cannot stop. Cioran realized that insomnia gave him access to a kind of truth that sleep protects people from. Sleep is merciful. It interrupts consciousness. It gives you a break from yourself. But without sleep, you see everything. You see that life is repetition, that tomorrow will be the same as today, that you are mortal, that nothing you do will last. These are not pleasant realizations, but they are true, and insomnia forces you to confront them. He also realized that night thinking is different from day thinking. During the day, the mind is active, purposeful, constructive. You solve problems, you make plans, you believe in progress. But at night, especially in the early hours of the morning, the mind becomes passive, circular, destructive. You do not solve problems. You see their insolubility. You do not make plans. You see their futility. The optimism of daylight dissolves. What remains is something colder and clearer. Cioran trusted night thinking more than day thinking. He believed that the thoughts that come at 3 in the morning are more honest than the thoughts that come at noon. During the day, you lie to yourself. You tell yourself that things will get better, that your work matters, that you are making progress. At night, you cannot maintain these lies. The truth breaks through. This is why he wrote at night. Not because it was romantic or atmospheric, but because it was the only time he could think clearly. He kept notebooks by his bed. When he could not sleep, he wrote. Fragments, aphorisms, observations, whatever came. He did not write systematically. He did not outline. He simply recorded what the night revealed. The content of these nocturnal thoughts was almost always dark. He wrote about death, futility, boredom, decay. He wrote about the emptiness of life, the absurdity of hope, the inevitability of failure. This was not because he chose to focus on dark topics. It was because these were the topics that insomnia brought to the surface. When you cannot sleep, when you are alone with your thoughts for hours, you do not think about happiness or success. You think about endings. Insomnia also destroyed his faith in philosophy as a discipline. Academic philosophy, the kind taught in universities, operates during the day. It is systematic, argumentative, constructive. It builds theories, solves puzzles, makes progress. But Cioran found this absurd. Philosophy that happens during the day is philosophy that has not confronted the darkness. It is philosophy that still believes in answers, in systems, in the possibility of understanding. The philosophy that happens at night is different. It does not build, it dismantles. It does not answer questions. It reveals that the questions are unanswerable. It does not offer hope. It removes illusions. This is what Cioran wanted to do, not to construct a system, but to record what remains when all systems collapse. His writing practice reflected this. He did not write books in the traditional sense. He wrote fragments, short paragraphs, a page or two at most, each one complete in itself. This was not a stylistic choice. It was the only form that matched the rhythm of his thinking. At night, you do not think in long arguments. You think in flashes, in sudden realizations, in isolated insights. The fragment was the natural form for this kind of thought. He also walked. This was part of the method. When he could not sleep, he got dressed and went out into the city. He walked for hours, sometimes until dawn. The walking was not for exercise. It was a way of managing the insomnia, of giving the body something to do while the mind churned. He walked through empty streets, past closed shops, along the Seine. The city at night became his landscape, the place where his thinking happened. Later, after he moved to Paris, the routine continued. He still could not sleep. He still walked at night. He still wrote in cafes at odd hours. The insomnia never went away. It became part of who he was. He did not try to cure it. He did not take pills or see doctors. He accepted it as his condition, the condition that made his work possible. There is a paradox here. Insomnia is suffering. It is exhausting, maddening, destructive. Cioran hated it. But it was also the source of everything he valued in his own thinking. Without insomnia, he would not have seen what he saw. He would not have written what he wrote. The suffering and the insight were inseparable. This is why he never romanticized insomnia. He did not say it was a gift. He did not say it made him special. He simply said it was his reality. And that reality had philosophical consequences. If you cannot sleep, if you spend your nights alone with your thoughts, you will eventually arrive at certain conclusions. You will see through the illusions that sustain normal life. You will stop believing in progress, in meaning, in the future. Not because you are depressed, but because you have had too much time to think. Cioran's insomnia also shaped his relationship to time. For most people, time is structured by sleep. You wake, you live through the day. You sleep, you wake again. There is a rhythm, a cycle. But for Cioran, there was no cycle. There was only continuous duration, hour after hour, thought after thought. Time did not renew itself. It simply accumulated. This made him acutely aware of time's weight, its oppressiveness, the way it drags you forward toward death without pause. In the end, insomnia was not just a condition Cioran had. It was the condition that produced his philosophy. Every position he took, every refusal he made, every negation he uttered, came out of those sleepless nights. The philosophy of 3 in the morning is a philosophy without illusions, without comfort, without hope. It is the philosophy of someone who has been awake too long and has seen too much. The suicide question, death as consolation. Cioran thought about suicide constantly. He wrote about it in almost every book. He discussed it in interviews. He told friends that the idea of suicide was what kept him alive. This sounds paradoxical, but for Cioran it was simple logic. Knowing that you can end your life at any moment makes life bearable. The exit is always there. You are not trapped. This is different from being suicidal in the clinical sense. Cioran was not making plans. He was not in crisis. He was not standing on a bridge. He was thinking about suicide philosophically, as a possibility, as a kind of freedom. The fact that you can choose not to exist means that your existence is not forced. It is something you are choosing moment by not killing yourself. The idea has a history. The Stoics talked about suicide as a rational exit when life became unendurable. Seneca wrote about it. Marcus Aurelius considered it. For them, suicide was not a failure or a sin. It was an option, one tool among others for managing fate. If the world became intolerable, if your virtue could no longer be maintained, you could leave. Cioran admired this coldness, this refusal to sentimentalize life. Schopenhauer also wrote about suicide, though he argued against it. He said that suicide does not escape the will to live. It is an act of the will, a violent assertion. What you want is not to kill yourself, but to kill the world, to make everything stop. But you cannot kill the world. You can only kill your body, and that does not solve the metaphysical problem. Cioran read Schopenhauer and partly agreed. Suicide is not a metaphysical solution, but it is still a practical one. Camus wrote that suicide is the only serious philosophical question. If life is absurd, if there is no meaning, why continue? Camus's answer was that you should revolt, that you should live in spite of the absurdity, that this is a kind of heroism. Cioran found this ridiculous. He did not believe in revolt. He did not believe in heroism. He thought Camus was still attached to life, still trying to make it noble. Cioran had no such attachment. For Cioran, the question of suicide is not whether you should do it. The question is why you have not done it yet. If existence is suffering, if consciousness is a burden, if there is no meaning or redemption, then the rational thing would be to end it. But people do not. They continue. Why? Cioran does not have a satisfying answer. He simply notes the fact. People cling to life even when life is unendurable. This says something about human irrationality, about the power of habit, about the strange force that keeps bodies moving forward. His own relationship to suicide was constant but abstract. He thought about it daily. He considered it an option, but he never acted. This was not because he lacked courage. It was because the idea itself was enough. As long as he knew he could kill himself tomorrow, he could endure today. The possibility of escape made the prison tolerable. This is what he meant when he said that suicide kept him alive. It was not a joke. It was a genuine psychological mechanism. The thought that you are not trapped, that you can leave whenever you want, removes the desperation. You are no longer a victim. You are someone choosing to stay, at least for now. And that choice, however temporary, however fragile, is enough to continue. Cioran also rejected the moral and religious arguments against suicide. He did not think suicide was a sin. He did not think it was cowardly. He did not think you owed it to others to stay alive. These are arguments that presuppose life has value, that existence is good, that you have obligations. Cioran rejected all of this. Life does not have value. Existence is not good. You have no obligations except the ones you invent. The religious prohibition against suicide struck him as particularly obscene. Christianity teaches that life is a gift from God and that only God can take it away. To kill yourself is to reject God's gift, to commit the ultimate sin. But if life is a gift, Cioran thought, it is a poison gift. You did not ask for it. You cannot return it except through death, and then you are punished for returning it. This logic seemed sadistic to him. He also noticed that people who talk most about the sanctity of life are often people whose lives are comfortable. They have health, money, purpose. It is easy to say that life is sacred when your life is bearable. But what about people in chronic pain? What about people in despair? What about people for whom every day is suffering? Telling them they must continue, that suicide is wrong, is a kind of cruelty. Cioran did not advocate for suicide. He did not tell anyone to kill themselves. He simply insisted that it should be an option, that people should have the right to choose. And he observed that most people, even people in terrible circumstances, do not choose it. They keep going. This fascinated him. What is this force that makes people cling to life? It is not rationality, it is not hope, it is something deeper, something biological, something that operates below the level of consciousness. There is also a temporal dimension to Cioran's thinking about suicide. He realized that the worst moments pass. If you wait, the intensity of suffering decreases. You do not have to solve the problem of existence. You just have to survive the next hour and then the next. Suicide is always available. There is no rush. This was another reason not to act. Why kill yourself today when you can kill yourself tomorrow? And if you can wait until tomorrow, you can wait until the day after, and so on. This is not optimism, it is postponement. It is the recognition that you do not have to make a final decision now. You can live provisionally, without commitment, simply because ending it requires effort and you are too tired to make the effort. This kind of passive continuation is what most of Cioran's life was. Not affirmation, not joy, just the continuation of a body that has not yet stopped. He also thought about the mechanics of suicide. How would you do it? Every method has drawbacks. Guns are violent, poison is uncertain, hanging is undignified. Jumping requires a specific kind of courage. The more you think about the practical details, the more complicated it becomes. And in that complication, the impulse fades. By the time you have figured out the method, the crisis has passed. Cioran's writing about suicide is cold. There is no sentimentality, no drama. He discusses it the way someone might discuss leaving a party. You are at the party. It is boring. You could leave. But leaving requires effort. So you stay a little longer. Maybe it will get better. Maybe it will not. Either way, the door is there. This coldness disturbed people. Readers accused him of being morbid, of encouraging despair. But Cioran did not see it that way. He thought he was being honest. Most people think about suicide at some point. Most people wonder at least once whether life is worth continuing, but they do not talk about it. They pretend the question does not exist. Cioran refused to pretend. In his final years, when Alzheimer's destroyed his mind, the question of suicide became moot. He could no longer think clearly enough to make the choice. The disease removed the very consciousness that had made existence unbearable. He became, in a sense, like an animal, living without reflection, without awareness of his own condition. The irony was not lost on those who knew his work. The man who spent his life hating consciousness ended his life without it. Against progress, the critique of history. Cioran hated the idea of progress. He hated it with a specific and sustained intensity. The belief that history is moving forward, that humanity is improving, that the future will be better than the past, struck him as the most dangerous illusion of modernity. The idea of progress has deep roots in Western thought. Christianity introduced the concept of linear time, the idea that history has a direction, moving from creation to apocalypse, from fall to redemption. The Enlightenment secularized this. History was still moving forward, but now the destination was not heaven but human perfection. Reason would replace superstition, science would replace ignorance, freedom would replace tyranny. The arc of history bent toward justice, toward improvement, toward some better version of humanity. Hegel made this into a philosophy. History was the unfolding of spirit, moving through stages toward absolute knowledge. Every conflict, every war, every revolution was part of this process. Nothing was wasted. Everything contributed to the final reconciliation. Marx took the structure and replaced spirit with material forces. History was class struggle, moving inevitably toward communism, toward a society without exploitation. The mechanism was different, but the logic was the same. History has a direction. History has a goal. We are moving toward it. Cioran rejected this completely. He did not believe history had a direction. He did not believe humanity was improving. He did not believe the future would be better. History for him was not progress. It was repetition. The same crimes, the same stupidities, the same delusions over and over in different costumes. He looked at the 20th century and saw proof. 2 world wars, totalitarianism, the Holocaust, the Gulag, Hiroshima. These were not aberrations. They were not temporary setbacks on the road to progress. They were what history produces. Modernity did not end barbarism. It industrialized barbarism. It made barbarism more efficient. The belief in progress, Cioran argued, is what makes atrocities possible. If you believe history is moving toward a goal, then anything can be justified in the name of that goal. Millions can be killed if it brings the revolution closer. Entire populations can be destroyed if it advances the race. The future justifies the present, and so the present becomes a slaughterhouse. This is what he meant when he said that optimism is more dangerous than pessimism. The pessimist does not believe in grand projects. The pessimist does not try to remake the world. The pessimist does not kill in the name of the future. The optimist does all of these things. The optimist believes that suffering today is worth it if it leads to paradise tomorrow. And paradise never comes. Only the suffering is real. Cioran also attacked the idea of historical meaning. People want to believe that events have significance, that history is a story with a plot. But history is not a story. It is chaos. Things happen. People die. Empires rise and fall. There is no pattern. There is no purpose. Historians invent patterns after the fact, imposing narratives on randomness. But the narratives are fiction. He was particularly hostile to Marxism, not because he was politically conservative. He had no politics. But because Marxism was the most systematic expression of historical optimism. Marxists believed they had discovered the laws of history. They believed they knew where history was going. They believed they could accelerate the process. And in the name of this belief, they built concentration camps. Cioran had lived through the appeal of Marxism. In the 1930s, many intellectuals were communists or communist sympathizers. They believed the Soviet Union was the future. They believed capitalism was dying. They believed revolution was inevitable and necessary. Cioran was never a Marxist, but he understood the appeal. It offered certainty. It offered hope. It offered a role in a grand historical drama. But by the 1950s, after Stalin, after the show trials, after the revelations, the appeal was gone. What remained was corpses and lies. He extended this critique to liberalism as well. Liberals believed in gradual progress, in reform, in the slow improvement of society through reason and law. Cioran found this naive. Liberalism assumed that people were rational, that they wanted freedom, that education would make them better. But people were not rational. They did not want freedom. Education did not make them better. It gave them better tools for killing each other. Cioran also despised utopianism in all its forms. Every utopia, he argued, is a disguised totalitarianism. The utopian imagines a perfect society and then asks how to get there. The answer is always the same: force. You must remake human nature. You must eliminate the people who do not fit. You must control every aspect of life. And in the process, you create hell while promising heaven. His alternative was not another system. It was the refusal of systems. He did not offer a better vision of history. He offered no vision at all. History does not need a vision. History is what happens when visions collide and destroy each other. The wise response is detachment, observation, refusal to participate in the grand projects that promise redemption and deliver death. Small nations, Cioran thought, understood this better than empires. Romania was a small nation. It had been conquered repeatedly. It had never had the power to impose its will on others. It had no grand historical mission. And this, he thought, was a kind of wisdom. Small nations know they do not matter. They know history will forget them. This humility is healthier than the megalomania of great powers. He also noticed that belief in progress required forgetting. You had to forget the past, forget the crimes, forget the failures. Every generation believed it was different, that it had learned from history, that it would not repeat the mistakes. But it always did. The same patterns recurred because human nature did not change. Technology changed, institutions changed, but the underlying drives, the violence, the stupidity, the will to dominate, these remained constant. Cioran's critique of progress was not based on nostalgia. He did not think the past was better. He did not want to return to some golden age. The past was just as terrible as the present. The difference was that people in the past did not lie to themselves about it. They did not think they were improving. They accepted tragedy, fate, limits. Modernity promised to overcome limits, and that promise was the lie. In his later work, Cioran softened slightly. He stopped arguing and started observing. He no longer attacked progress with the fury of his youth. He simply noted its absurdity, its persistence, the way people continue to believe in it despite all evidence. This shift was not optimism, it was exhaustion. He had said everything he had to say. The world had not listened. History continued. And he continued to watch, detached, without hope or illusion. The death of God and after. Nietzsche announced that God is dead. Cioran lived in the aftermath. He did not need to kill God. God was already gone. The question was, what comes next? The death of God for Nietzsche was an event. It had happened. European culture had killed God through science, through rationalism, through the erosion of religious authority. But most people had not noticed yet. They were still living as if God existed, still operating with Christian morality, still assuming the universe had meaning. Nietzsche's task was to make people see what had happened and to think through the consequences. Cioran accepted the diagnosis, but not the response. Nietzsche said that after God's death, humanity would have to create new values, that the Übermensch would emerge, that life would be affirmed in new ways. Cioran thought this was fantasy. After God's death, there is nothing, no new values, no affirmation, only emptiness. He did not experience God's death as liberation. He experienced it as loss. Not because he wanted God to exist. He did not believe in God. He did not pray. He did not hope for resurrection or salvation. But he understood what God had provided. God gave the universe structure. God gave suffering meaning. God made death something other than annihilation. Without God, all of this collapses. Cioran had been raised Orthodox Christian. His father was a priest. He had grown up with icons, incense, liturgy. The Orthodox Church, especially in rural Romania, was not primarily about doctrine. It was about ritual, about a certain atmosphere, about the sense that the world was not just matter but also spirit. Cioran lost faith early, probably in his teenage years, but he never lost the sense that something had been lost. This is what separated him from atheists who were cheerful about God's death. Atheists like Bertrand Russell or A.J. Ayer treated religion as a mistake that had finally been corrected. Now that we know there is no God, we can build a rational society based on science and ethics. Cioran found this absurd. Losing God was not like correcting an error, it was like losing gravity. Everything that had been held in place now floated free. He was drawn to the mystics precisely because they had experienced God's presence and then God's absence. St. John of the Cross wrote about the dark night of the soul, the period when God withdraws and the soul is left in emptiness. Teresa of Avila described ecstasies and also desolations. These were not people who had never believed. They had believed totally, and they had experienced both the fullness of faith and its collapse. Cioran, who had never had faith, nevertheless recognized their descriptions of absence. The spiritual void left by God's death was not something that could be filled. This was Cioran's central claim. People tried to fill it with politics, with art, with science, with pleasure, but nothing worked. Politics became a religion and produced totalitarianism. Art became a religion and produced pretension. Science became a religion and produced hubris. Pleasure became a religion and produced emptiness. The void remained. He also argued that modern people did not fully understand what they had lost. They thought they had lost a belief, a hypothesis about the universe. But they had lost much more. They had lost the sense that existence was justified. In a Christian universe, suffering has meaning. It is a test, a punishment, a path to redemption. Without God, suffering is just suffering. It does not lead anywhere. It does not mean anything. You suffer. You die. You are forgotten. Cioran was suspicious of people who claimed to have moved beyond religion without difficulty. He thought they were lying or shallow. If you truly understood what God's death meant, it would devastate you. It would not leave you cheerful. It would not leave you optimistic about human potential. It would leave you in a state of metaphysical vertigo, unable to find solid ground. At the same time, he could not return to faith. He had read too much, thought too much, seen too much. He could not make himself believe in doctrines he knew were false. He could not pray to a God he knew did not exist. He was stuck in the aftermath, unable to go back, unable to move forward. This is why he was drawn to Buddhism and Hinduism. These traditions did not require belief in a personal God. They offered practices, techniques for managing consciousness, for reducing suffering. The goal was not salvation but extinction, not heaven but the cessation of desire. Cioran found this more honest than Christianity. At least Buddhism admitted that existence was suffering. At least it did not pretend that suffering had a purpose. But he could not commit to Buddhism either. He admired it intellectually, but he was too Western, too individualistic, too attached to his own consciousness. Buddhism required discipline, practice, renunciation. Cioran had none of these. He was lazy, scattered, incapable of sustained effort. He could read about Buddhism, he could appreciate its insights, but he could not live it. What remained was a kind of post-religious melancholy. He was nostalgic for a world in which the sacred was real, even though he knew that world was gone. He envied people who still believed, even though he thought they were deluded. He hated modern secularism, even though he was secular himself. He was trapped between a past he could not return to and a present he could not accept. This melancholy shaped all his writing. His tone was not angry, it was mournful. He did not attack God. He mourned God's absence. He did not celebrate freedom from religion. He described the coldness of a universe without transcendence. His was a philosophy written in the ruins of faith. In his later years, Cioran stopped writing about God directly. The subject exhausted itself. God was dead. Nothing would bring him back. Talking about it changed nothing. What remained was the task of living in a world without God, without meaning, without consolation. And this task had no solution. You simply continued day after day in the void. consciousness as curse, the burden of self-awareness. Cioran believed that consciousness was humanity's defining misfortune. Not consciousness as simple awareness, but self-consciousness, reflexivity, the ability to observe yourself observing. This is what separates humans from animals. And this is what makes human life unbearable. An animal lives in the world. It does not stand outside the world watching itself live. A dog does not wonder if it is living correctly. A bird does not question the meaning of its existence. Animals act from instinct, from hunger, from fear, from desire, but they do not reflect on these actions. They do not ask why, they simply are. Humans cannot do this. Humans are cursed with the ability to step back from experience and analyze it. You are not just hungry. You are aware that you are hungry. You are aware that this hunger will return. You are aware that satisfying hunger does not end hunger permanently. You are aware that you are a creature driven by needs you did not choose. And this awareness poisons the satisfaction. Cioran called this the fall into consciousness. It was not a biblical fall. It was an evolutionary or developmental event. At some point in history or in individual life, humans gained the ability to reflect on themselves. And from that moment, they were expelled from the immediacy of existence. They became spectators of their own lives. This theme appears across his work. In The Fall into Time, he argues that entering time, becoming aware of duration and death, is the original catastrophe. Before consciousness, there is only the present. After consciousness, there is past and future. You remember what you have lost. You anticipate what you will lose. The present becomes a thin line between regret and anxiety. Self-consciousness also destroys spontaneity. Children are spontaneous. They act without calculation. They feel without analysis. But as they grow older, as consciousness develops, spontaneity dies. Every action becomes self-conscious. Every emotion is observed by a part of the mind that stands apart. You can no longer simply cry. You are aware that you are crying, and the awareness changes the crying, makes it less pure, less real. Cioran envied people who were less conscious. He envied peasants, laborers, anyone whose life was simple and unreflective. They worked, they ate, they slept. They did not spend hours analyzing their existence. They did not lie awake wondering why they were born. Their consciousness was dim enough that they could still live. He also envied earlier historical periods. Ancient people, he thought, lived more instinctively. They had myths and gods and rituals that structured their lives. They did not question these structures. They simply inhabited them. Modernity had destroyed this. Modernity made everything self-conscious. Nothing could be taken for granted. Every belief had to be examined, justified, defended. And in that process, belief became impossible. The paradox is that consciousness claims to be enlightenment, but it functions as imprisonment. To be conscious is to know more, to see more, to understand more. But this knowledge does not liberate, it traps. You know that you will die. This knowledge does not help you. It only makes every moment shadowed by death. You know that your achievements will be forgotten. This knowledge does not inspire you. It makes effort seem pointless. Cioran also noted that consciousness feeds on itself. The more you think, the more you become aware of thinking. The more you observe yourself, the more you become aware of observing. There is no end to this regression. You can always step back one more level, and each level adds another layer of distance between you and your own life. This is why he valued moments of unconsciousness so highly. Sleep, if he could achieve it, was relief. Drunkenness was relief. Anything that turned off the constant self-monitoring was relief. He did not romanticize these states. He simply recognized that consciousness was exhausting and that any break from it was a gift. He also argued that consciousness makes morality unbearable. An animal that kills does not feel guilt. It kills from hunger or fear. It does not reflect on the act, but a human who kills is conscious of killing. The act is recorded, remembered, judged. Consciousness turns action into guilt, and the more conscious you are, the more guilt you feel, even for things you have not done, even for existing at all. This connects to his idea about original sin. Christianity says humans are born sinful. Cioran says humans are born conscious, and consciousness is the sin. To be aware of yourself is to be aware of your separateness, your finitude, your guilt. You are guilty simply by virtue of being a self. Cioran found no solution to the burden of consciousness. You cannot choose to be less conscious. You cannot unlearn self-awareness. Once you have it, it is permanent. The only escape is death, and even that is uncertain. You cannot know if consciousness ends with death. It might continue in some form. The thought was unbearable. Some philosophers argued that consciousness was humanity's glory. Descartes said, "I think, therefore I am," as if thinking proved something valuable. Hegel said consciousness was spirit becoming aware of itself, the highest achievement of existence. Sartre said consciousness was freedom, the ability to choose, to create meaning. Cioran rejected all of this. Consciousness was not glory, it was disease. He also rejected the idea that consciousness leads to wisdom. Knowledge does not make you happier, it makes you sadder. Awareness does not improve life, it reveals life's horror. The more you know, the worse it gets. Ignorance, stupidity, unconsciousness, these are blessings. Intelligence is a curse. This is why he had no interest in education as salvation. Enlightenment thinkers believed that educating people would make them better, freer, more rational. Cioran thought education made people worse. It made them more conscious, more reflective, more aware of their condition. And awareness of your condition does not improve your condition. It only makes you suffer more clearly. In his final years, Alzheimer's removed his consciousness piece by piece. He forgot names, then words, then concepts. He forgot who he was. The self that had been so burdened by self-awareness dissolved. Those who knew him reported that he seemed, at the end, almost peaceful. The curse had lifted. He was no longer conscious. He was no longer himself. And perhaps in that erasure, he found the relief he had been writing about for 70 years. The aphorism as weapon, why no system? Cioran never wrote a systematic treatise. He never constructed a philosophical system. He wrote in fragments, aphorisms, disconnected paragraphs that could be read in any order. This was not accident or laziness. It was a deliberate rejection of what philosophy had become. Western philosophy, especially since Descartes, has been dominated by the idea of the system. A philosopher begins with foundations, builds arguments, constructs a logical edifice. Spinoza wrote his Ethics like a geometry textbook with axioms and proofs. Kant wrote 3 massive critiques, each attempting to establish the conditions of knowledge, morality, and judgment. Hegel built a system so comprehensive, it claimed to explain everything from logic to history to art. Cioran found this approach dishonest. A system claims to be complete. It claims to answer questions definitively. It claims to fit all of reality into a coherent structure. But reality is not coherent. Existence does not fit into logical categories. The systematic philosopher is not describing the world. He is building a monument to his own need for order. The aphorism does the opposite. It makes a single claim and stops. It does not derive from first principles. It does not lead to further conclusions. It stands alone. If it is true in isolation. If it is false, it does not bring down an entire system. This modesty, this refusal to claim too much, was what Cioran valued. He had models for this approach. Nietzsche wrote in aphorisms, especially in books like Human, All Too Human and The Gay Science. Nietzsche distrusted systems. He said that a philosopher who builds a system is a philosopher who cannot be trusted because life is too complex to be systematized. Cioran agreed completely. Before Nietzsche, there were the French moralists. La Rochefoucauld wrote maxims, short observations about human nature and society. Chamfort wrote aphorisms that were bitter, precise, devastating. Pascal wrote fragments that were meant to become a systematic defense of Christianity, but remained fragments. And in their fragmentary form, they are more powerful than any finished system could have been. Cioran read these writers obsessively. He felt more kinship with them than with any academic philosopher. Further back, there were the ancient skeptics. Sextus Empiricus argued against certainty, against dogmatism, against the claim that we can know anything definitively. His method was to present arguments on both sides of every question and show that neither side could win. This suspension of judgment, this refusal to commit to a position, appealed to Cioran. Not because he was a skeptic in the technical sense, but because he valued intellectual honesty over intellectual ambition. The aphorism also matched Cioran's experience of thinking. He did not think systematically. He thought in bursts, in sudden realizations, in moments of clarity that came and went. When you are awake at 3 a.m, you do not construct arguments. You have insights. A thought strikes you. You write it down. Then another thought comes, unrelated to the first. You write that down too. Over time, you accumulate fragments, but they do not add up to a system. They accumulate like debris. This was exactly how Cioran worked. He kept notebooks. He wrote down whatever came to him wherever he was. A sentence, a paragraph, an observation. Later, he would go through the notebooks and select the fragments he wanted to keep. He would revise them, compress them, polish them until every word was necessary. Then he would arrange them into books. But the arrangement was not systematic. There was no argument running through the book. There were just fragments placed next to each other, sometimes contradicting each other. This contradiction was intentional. Cioran did not believe in consistency. He thought consistency was a form of intellectual cowardice. If you think deeply about anything, you will arrive at contradictory conclusions. You will see truth on both sides. To force yourself to choose one side and defend it against the other is to falsify your own experience. Better to present both sides and let the contradictions stand. For example, Cioran wrote that life is unbearable and also that suicide is not a solution. He wrote that consciousness is a curse and also that unconsciousness is degrading. He wrote that history is meaningless and also that certain historical moments reveal essential truths. These positions do not fit together logically, but they were all things he believed at different times in different moods. The aphorism allowed him to express all of them without forcing a false reconciliation. The aphorism is also more honest about the limits of language. A system implies that language can capture reality, that concepts can map onto things, that thought can be made transparent. But language is slippery. Words mean different things in different contexts. Concepts are approximations. Thought is always in motion. The aphorism acknowledges this. It makes its claim and stops before language can fail completely. Cioran also valued the aphorism for its violence. A good aphorism is sharp. It cuts. It does not explain or justify. It asserts. This directness was important to him. He did not want to persuade. He did not want to argue. He wanted to state what he saw and leave it there. If the reader recognized the truth of it, good. If not, no amount of argumentation would help. There is also certain cruelty in the aphorism. It refuses to comfort. It refuses to soften the blow. Where a systematic treatise might build up to a difficult conclusion, preparing the reader, offering context, the aphorism delivers the conclusion immediately, without preparation. This shock value was something Cioran appreciated. Philosophy should disturb, not console. The disadvantage of the aphorism is that it can seem superficial. Without argumentation, without evidence, it is just assertion. Why should anyone believe it? Cioran's answer was that philosophical truth is not a matter of proof. It is a matter of recognition. You either see it or you do not. If you need proof, you will never be convinced. If you see it, no proof is necessary. This places enormous demands on the writer. In a system, mediocre ideas can hide behind elaborate argumentation. In an aphorism, there is nowhere to hide. Every sentence must be sharp, true, necessary. Cioran met this demand through obsessive revision. He would rewrite a single sentence dozens of times. He would cut words, rearrange clauses, test different rhythms. The goal was compression, clarity, impact. He also avoided jargon. Academic philosophers invent technical terms, build specialized vocabularies, create languages that only other philosophers can understand. Cioran wrote in ordinary language. His sentences are clear. A non-philosopher can read them and understand them. This accessibility was not simplification, it was precision. He found the exact words to express complex ideas without hiding behind abstraction. The aphorism also suited Cioran's position as an outsider. He had no academic position. He was not part of any philosophical school. He did not participate in debates or conferences. He did not need to prove himself to other philosophers. This freedom allowed him to write without regard for professional standards, without trying to fit into any tradition. He could simply say what he thought. In the end, the aphorism was not just a style, it was an epistemology. It was a claim about what philosophy can and cannot do. Philosophy cannot build systems that explain everything. It cannot answer the big questions definitively. It cannot resolve contradictions. What it can do is observe, articulate, disturb. It can capture moments of insight. It can say true things, even if those truths do not fit together into a coherent whole. The aphorism is the form that accepts these limits and works within them. Writing in French, the language suicide. In 1947, at the age of 36, Cioran made a decision that would define the rest of his writing life. He stopped writing in Romanian and began writing in French. The decision was not purely practical. It was a form of self-amputation, a deliberate cutting away of part of his identity. Romanian was his mother tongue. It was the language of his childhood, his education, his first books. He had written 5 books in Romanian between 1934 and 1944. These books were passionate, chaotic, excessive. The language allowed him to be wild, to let his thoughts pour out without restraint. Romanian was a small language, spoken by fewer than 20 million people, mostly in Romania and Moldova. It was marginal to European culture, but it was his. French was different. French was a major language, the language of Descartes and Voltaire, of clarity and precision. It was the language of the Enlightenment, of rationalism, of order. To write in French meant to submit to discipline, to accept constraints, to control the excesses that Romanian had permitted. Cioran later said that he changed languages to escape himself. In Romanian, he knew exactly how to say anything. The words came automatically. He could write quickly, fluently, without effort. But this fluency was dangerous. It allowed him to be sloppy, to repeat himself, to indulge in rhetoric. French forced him to slow down. He did not have automatic fluency. He had to think about every word, every phrase, every sentence structure. The transition was painful. For months he struggled. His French was academic, correct, but stiff. He sounded like a foreigner, which he was. He could not find his voice. He could not achieve the precision he wanted. He read French writers obsessively, trying to absorb the rhythms of the language. He read the moralists, the stylists, the masters of the French sentence. He read Chateaubriand for melody, Flaubert for precision, Valéry for compression. He also rewrote constantly. A single page might take days. He would write a sentence, cross it out, try again, cross it out again. He was looking for something specific, a sentence that was clear, compressed, and sharp. No wasted words, no unnecessary adjectives, no rhetorical flourishes, just the thought, expressed as directly as possible. This process was torturous, but also liberating. In Romanian, he had been too good. He could write beautiful sentences without thinking. But beauty without discipline becomes decoration. French forced him to earn every sentence. If a sentence worked in French, it was because he had built it carefully, word by word. This gave the sentence a hardness, a density that his Romanian writing lacked. The first book he completed in French was A Short History of Decay, published in 1949. It took him years to write. The book is a collection of essays and fragments on history, culture, decadence, death. The style is compressed, aphoristic, cold. The tone is utterly different from his Romanian books. Where those were hot, this was cold. Where those were excessive, this was controlled. Where those were young, this was old. The book won the Rivarol Prize, an award for French books written by non-French authors. This recognition mattered to Cioran. It meant he had succeeded in becoming a French writer, or at least in writing in French at a level that native speakers respected. But it also confirmed his exile. He was a Romanian who wrote in French. He belonged fully to neither language, neither culture. Other writers have changed languages. Joseph Conrad wrote in English, though it was his third language after Polish and French. Vladimir Nabokov switched from Russian to English. Samuel Beckett, Cioran's friend, switched from English to French. But these switches were often driven by exile or audience. Cioran's switch was different. He was not trying to reach a larger audience. His books sold poorly in any language. He switched because he needed the discipline that French imposed. He also said that French was a language that prevented him from lying. In Romanian, he could say anything. The language was flexible enough, poetic enough, that he could create beautiful lies. French did not permit this. French demanded clarity, and clarity forced honesty. If you could not say something clearly in French, it was probably because it was not true. This is an exaggeration, but it points to something real. Language shapes thought. Different languages make different things easy or difficult to say. Romanian allowed Cioran to be lyrical, emotional, vague. French required him to be precise, controlled, exact. The change in language changed what he could write about and how he could write about it. There was also a psychological dimension. By abandoning Romanian, Cioran was abandoning part of his past. He was cutting ties with his youth, with his early books, with his involvement in Romanian politics. French allowed him to become someone else. Not a new person, but a version of himself stripped of certain memories, certain associations. It was a kind of cleansing. But the cleansing was incomplete. He still thought in Romanian. His dreams were in Romanian. When he spoke with Romanian friends, he spoke Romanian. The language was still inside him, inaccessible to his French readers, invisible in his French books. This created a strange doubling. He was a Romanian inside, a French writer outside. The two did not quite match. In later interviews, Cioran sometimes expressed regret about the switch. He said that Romanian was a more beautiful language than French, more musical, more expressive. He said that French was a dry language, a language of analysis, not of feeling. But he also said that the switch was necessary. If he had continued writing in Romanian, he would have repeated himself forever. French saved him from that. He also noted that writing in a foreign language gave him a certain distance from his own thoughts. When you write in your mother tongue, the words feel like they come from inside you. They feel natural, inevitable. When you write in a foreign language, the words feel external. You are choosing them deliberately, arranging them consciously. This distance allowed Cioran to be colder, more detached, more analytical. The later books, all written in French, are different from the Romanian books in fundamental ways. They are shorter, more controlled, less emotional. They do not argue or persuade, they observe and record. The sentences are clean, almost surgical. There is no excess, no decoration, no warmth. This coldness became Cioran's signature, and it was a coldness that French made possible. Near the end of his life, when Alzheimer's began to destroy his memory, he lost French first. He reverted to Romanian, speaking it with the nurses and visitors who could not understand him. The language of his childhood returned as the language of his adulthood disappeared. He died in French, so to speak, but he ended in Romanian. The circle closed, though he was no longer conscious of it. Style as the only value. For Cioran, style was not decoration. It was not something added to thought to make it more pleasant. Style was the only thing that mattered. When content is despair, when the message is that existence is meaningless and consciousness is suffering, form becomes everything. This position is extreme, but it was completely sincere. Cioran believed that philosophical truth was worthless without literary expression. An ugly truth is not worth stating. A clumsy sentence does not deserve to be read. If you cannot say something beautifully, you should not say it at all. This was not aestheticism in the usual sense. Aesthetes believe that beauty is the highest value, that art justifies life. Cioran did not believe this. He did not think beauty justified anything, but he did think that if you are going to write, if you are going to add more words to the already unbearable quantity of words in the world, those words should at least be well crafted. He spent enormous amounts of time on revision. He wrote slowly, painfully, obsessively. A single page could take days. He would write a sentence, read it aloud, listen to the rhythm, change a word, read it again, change another word. He was looking for something precise, a sentence that was clear, compressed, and musical. Every word had to be necessary. Every clause had to earn its place. This process was not about perfecting an idea. The idea was usually simple. Being born is terrible. Consciousness is suffering. Death is the only certainty. These thoughts do not require elaboration. What required work was finding the exact words to express them, the exact rhythm to make them strike the reader. Cioran admired writers for whom style was paramount. Flaubert, who rewrote sentences dozens of times, who spent days searching for the right word, who believed that there was only one correct way to say anything. Flaubert's subject matter was often banal. His novels are about provincial life, bourgeois stupidity, ordinary unhappiness. But the sentences are perfect. Every word is in the right place. This perfection redeems the banality. Cioran also admired the French moralists, writers like La Rochefoucauld and Chamfort, who compressed complex observations into single sentences. A maxim is the ultimate test of style. You have one sentence. It must be clear, true, memorable. There is no room for error, no room for vagueness. If the sentence fails, the entire thought fails. He read Valéry, the poet and essayist who believed that literature was primarily about language, about working with words the way a sculptor works with stone. Valéry said that poetry is made of words, not ideas. Cioran agreed, though he was writing prose. Prose too is made of words. The quality of the words determines the quality of the thought. This emphasis on style created a paradox. Cioran's content was nihilistic. He said that nothing matters, that existence is meaningless, that all effort is futile. But he wrote as if writing mattered enormously. He labored over every sentence as if each one were a matter of life and death. The contradiction was not lost on him. He acknowledged it, but he did not resolve it. His explanation was that style was the only form of salvation available to someone who did not believe in salvation. You cannot believe in God, in progress, in meaning, but you can still make a sentence beautiful. You can still arrange words in a way that pleases you. This is not much, but it is something. And when everything else is gone, it is enough. Style also provided a kind of justification for existence. Cioran did not believe life was worth living, but if he could write a perfect sentence, then at least that sentence was worth existing. The sentence might outlast him. People might read it and recognize its truth, its beauty. This was not immortality, but it was a small victory over death. There was also a moral dimension. For Cioran, bad writing was a form of dishonesty. Writers who were careless with language were careless with truth. If you cannot be bothered to find the right word, why should anyone believe you have anything important to say? Sloppiness in style reveals sloppiness in thought. He had contempt for academic philosophy precisely because of its style. Academic philosophers wrote badly. They used jargon, convoluted syntax, unnecessarily long sentences. They hid behind abstraction. This was not just an aesthetic failure, it was a moral failure. It revealed that these philosophers were more interested in sounding intelligent than in being clear. Cioran's own sentences are models of clarity. They are short, they are direct, they use ordinary words. A non-philosopher can read them and understand them immediately. But this simplicity is deceptive. Achieving that clarity required enormous effort. Every simple sentence was the result of cutting away everything unnecessary, everything that blurred the thought. He also believed that rhythm mattered. A sentence is not just a sequence of words, it is a sound pattern. Read aloud, it should have a certain music. Cioran read everything he wrote aloud, testing the rhythm, listening for false notes. If a sentence sounded wrong, he changed it, even if the meaning was clear. This attention to sound seems strange for a philosopher. Philosophy is supposed to be about ideas, not music, but Cioran insisted that the two were inseparable. How you say something affects what you are saying. A clumsy sentence cannot express a subtle thought. A beautiful sentence can make a commonplace thought seem profound. Style also allowed Cioran to control tone. He did not want to sound angry or bitter or desperate. Even though his content was dark, he wanted to sound cold, detached, almost indifferent. This coldness was achieved through style. Short sentences, no exclamation marks, no rhetorical questions, no emotional appeals, just statements delivered calmly as if reporting the weather. This tone made his writing more disturbing, not less. If he had written in an emotional register, readers could dismiss him as depressed or unstable, but he wrote calmly, clearly, rationally. This made his conclusions harder to avoid. He was not ranting, he was observing, and his observations were accurate. In his final books, style became even more important as content became more repetitive. Cioran had said everything he had to say by his 50s. After that, he was essentially rephrasing the same thoughts, but each rephrasing was an opportunity to find a better sentence, a more precise formulation. The work was not about discovering new ideas, it was about perfecting the expression of old ones. When Alzheimer's took his ability to write, it took everything that mattered to him. He could no longer form sentences, he could no longer revise, he could no longer work on style. The disease did not just remove his memory, it removed his only source of meaning. Without the ability to make sentences, he was nothing. Influences and intellectual context. Cioran did not emerge from nowhere. He had sources, influences, traditions that shaped his thinking. Understanding these contexts illuminates what was original in his work and what he inherited. The first and most obvious influence was Romanian orthodoxy. Cioran's father was a priest. He grew up surrounded by icons, liturgy, incense, the rhythms of the church calendar. Orthodox Christianity, especially in its Romanian form, was not primarily about theology or doctrine. It was about ritual, atmosphere, a certain emotional tone. The liturgy was long, repetitive, solemn. It emphasized suffering, death, resurrection. It had a tragic sensibility, a focus on human weakness and divine mystery. Cioran lost his faith early, probably by his late teens, but he never lost the emotional structure that orthodoxy had given him. His obsession with suffering, his sense of life as tragic, his distrust of optimism, these were all rooted in Orthodox Christianity. He replaced God with nothing, but the mood remained. Orthodox mysticism also influenced him. He read the Philokalia, a collection of Orthodox spiritual texts focused on prayer, contemplation, and the struggle against sin. These texts describe techniques for managing the mind, for achieving stillness, for confronting inner darkness. Cioran had no interest in the religious goal, but he recognized the psychological accuracy of the descriptions. The second major influence was German philosophy, especially Schopenhauer and Nietzsche. Schopenhauer argued that existence is suffering, that the will drives all life, and that the only escape is through renunciation or aesthetic contemplation. Cioran absorbed this completely. He agreed that existence is suffering. He agreed that the will is blind and destructive, but he rejected Schopenhauer's solutions. Renunciation requires discipline. Aesthetic contemplation requires detachment. Cioran had neither. Nietzsche was more complicated. Cioran admired Nietzsche's style, his aphoristic method, his willingness to contradict himself. He admired Nietzsche's critique of Christianity, his exposure of resentment and slave morality. But he rejected Nietzsche's affirmations. Nietzsche said yes to life, yes to suffering, yes to eternal recurrence. Cioran said no, he could not affirm. He could only observe and refuse. He also read Heidegger, though with less enthusiasm. Heidegger's analysis of being toward death, of anxiety, of thrownness, resonated with Cioran's experience. But Heidegger's language was too elaborate, too systematic. Cioran wanted directness, not ontology. He took what he needed from Heidegger and discarded the rest. Spengler's The Decline of the West influenced Cioran's views on history and civilization. Spengler argued that civilizations are organisms that grow, mature, and decay. Western civilization was in decline, exhausted, moving toward death. Cioran agreed with this diagnosis and extended it. Not just Western civilization, but all civilization, all human effort, was decay disguised as progress. The third influence was Spanish mysticism. Cioran read St. John of the Cross and St. Teresa of Avila extensively. These were mystics who experienced both ecstasy and desolation, both the presence of God and the dark night of the soul. Cioran, who had no God, nevertheless recognized their descriptions. He had experienced something similar, moments of transcendence followed by crushing emptiness. The mystics gave him a vocabulary for these experiences. He also read Eastern philosophy, especially Buddhism and Hinduism. He read the Upanishads, the Bhagavad Gita, Buddhist sutras. He was drawn to the idea of suffering as the fundamental fact of existence, to the concept of Maya, or illusion, to the goal of extinguishing desire. Buddhism's pessimism matched his own, but he could not follow Buddhism's practices. He could not meditate. He could not renounce. He remained a Western intellectual, reading about Eastern wisdom but incapable of embodying it. The French moralists were another key influence. La Rochefoucauld wrote maxims exposing human vanity and selfishness. Chamfort wrote aphorisms of devastating cynicism. Pascal wrote fragments about human misery and the need for God. These writers combined philosophical depth with literary precision. They said profound things in perfect sentences. This was exactly what Cioran wanted to do. He also read the French existentialists, though he rejected the label when applied to himself. Sartre argued that existence precedes essence, that humans are free to create meaning. Cioran thought this was absurd. Humans are not free. They are trapped in bodies, in time, in consciousness. They do not create meaning. They suffer the absence of meaning. Camus wrote about the absurd and the necessity of revolt. Cioran found revolt pointless. The absurd cannot be overcome by heroism. Romanian culture itself was an influence, though Cioran was ambivalent about it. Romania was a small country on the periphery of Europe caught between empires, never quite modern, never quite traditional. This peripheral status gave Romanians a certain skepticism about grand projects and historical missions. They knew they did not matter. This humility, this sense of being outside history, shaped Cioran's perspective. Finally, there was the influence of his own generation. Cioran came of age in the 1930s, a decade of ideological extremism, fascism, communism, nationalism, all promised to remake the world. Many intellectuals were seduced. Cioran himself briefly sympathized with the Iron Guard, but he witnessed the consequences: war, dictatorship, mass murder. This experience inoculated him against all ideologies. He spent the rest of his life refusing every grand narrative, every promise of salvation. Understanding these influences does not explain Cioran. He was not simply a synthesis of his sources. He took from each tradition what suited him and discarded the rest. From orthodoxy, he took the mood, not the theology. From Schopenhauer, he took the pessimism, not the solutions. From Nietzsche, he took the style, not the affirmations. From Buddhism, he took the diagnosis, not the cure. What made Cioran distinctive was the combination and the extremity. Other pessimists offered escapes. Schopenhauer offered art and renunciation. Buddhism offered enlightenment. Christianity offered salvation. Cioran offered nothing. He simply described the horror and left you in it. This refusal to console, to solve, to promise was his originality. Ecstasy and despair, the mystical pessimist. Cioran is usually read as a pessimist, a nihilist, a philosopher of despair. This is accurate but incomplete. There was another dimension to his experience, one that complicates the simple narrative of negation. He had moments of ecstasy, of transcendence, of something he could only describe as mystical experience. These experiences began in his youth, during his university years in Bucharest. He was 19 or 20. He had been suffering from insomnia for several years. He was exhausted, desperate, on the edge of collapse. And then, in the middle of this suffering, something broke open. He experienced what he later called a cosmic consciousness, a sense of total unity with existence, a dissolution of boundaries between self and world. He described these moments in his first book, On the Heights of Despair, written when he was 22. The tone of that book is ecstatic, almost delirious. He writes about ascending to heights where ordinary consciousness dissolves, where you touch something absolute. The experience was not peaceful. It was violent, overwhelming, almost unbearable, but it was also transcendent. This created a fundamental paradox in Cioran's life and thought. He experienced existence as both unbearable suffering and overwhelming ecstasy. These were not different things. They were two aspects of the same intensity. The heights of despair and the heights of ecstasy were the same heights. Intensity itself, whether positive or negative, was what mattered. This is very different from ordinary depression. Depression is numbness, flatness, the inability to feel anything. Cioran was not depressed in this sense. He felt everything too intensely. Life was too much, too vivid, too present. The suffering came from this excess of feeling, not from its absence. He recognized this intensity in certain mystics. St. John of the Cross wrote about the dark night of the soul, a state where God is absent and the soul suffers in complete desolation. But this desolation is also a kind of presence. God's absence is felt so intensely that it becomes another form of encounter. Cioran had no God, but he understood the structure of the experience. The absence was as overwhelming as a presence. Saint Teresa of Avila described mystical ecstasies where she felt wounded by divine love, pierced by something both painful and beautiful. The language she used was erotic, violent, excessive. Cioran read her and recognized something. Not the theology, but the phenomenology, the intensity, the sense of being overwhelmed, the collapse of normal consciousness. He also read the Upanishads and found descriptions of states where the individual self dissolves into Brahman, into the Absolute. The experience is described as bliss, but also as the extinction of the personal. You lose yourself. You become everything and therefore nothing. Cioran had experienced something like this, though without the religious framework. What made Cioran unusual was that he did not interpret these experiences religiously. He did not think they revealed God or ultimate reality. He thought they revealed the structure of consciousness itself. Consciousness can intensify to the point where it breaks through its normal boundaries. This breaking through feels transcendent, feels like contact with something beyond the self, but it is just consciousness operating at an extreme. This interpretation did not diminish the experiences. They were still real, they still mattered, but they did not mean what mystics thought they meant. They were not evidence of God. They were evidence of consciousness's capacity to exceed itself, to escape its own limits temporarily. As Cioran aged, these experiences became rarer. The ecstasies of his youth did not return. What remained was the memory of them and the knowledge that they were possible. This knowledge shaped everything he wrote. He was not writing from simple despair. He was writing from the memory of ecstasy and the knowledge that ecstasy does not last, does not solve anything, does not change the fundamental conditions of existence. There was also the role of music. Music, especially Bach, could trigger something close to those early experiences. Listening to the Goldberg variations or the Mass in B minor, Cioran felt transported, lifted out of himself. Music was the one thing that could still produce transcendence, not through ideas or images, but through pure structure, pure sound. This is why music remained important to him throughout his life. It was not entertainment. It was a technique for altering consciousness, for reaching states that were otherwise inaccessible. When everything else failed, when philosophy offered no consolation, when writing felt futile, music still worked. But music also deepened his pessimism. Music proved that transcendence was possible. You could experience something beyond the ordinary, something absolute. But then the music ended. You returned to yourself. The transcendence did not last, and knowing that it was possible but temporary made the ordinary more unbearable. Cioran also recognized that these mystical experiences were useless. They did not make him better. They did not solve his problems. They did not even make him happier, except during the experience itself. Afterward, he was the same person with the same insomnias, the same despairs. The experience added intensity, but not meaning. This separated him from religious mystics who interpreted their experiences as transformative. They believed that mystical experience changed you, brought you closer to God, made you more virtuous. Cioran experienced mysticism as pure phenomenon, without consequence. You touch something absolute, and then you return to the relative, unchanged. The combination of mysticism and pessimism made Cioran difficult to categorize. He was too mystical for the rationalists, too pessimistic for the mystics. He could not fit into either category. He belonged to both and to neither. In his later writing, he rarely discussed these experiences directly. They had faded into the past. What remained was a certain tone, a sense that he was writing from some extreme place, some edge of experience. The ecstasies were gone, but they had marked him. They had shown him that existence could be more than ordinary consciousness, and this knowledge made ordinary consciousness even harder to bear. Bach in the abyss. Music was not a hobby for Cioran. It was a necessity. Among all the arts, music alone could still move him, still transport him, still make existence briefly tolerable. And among all composers, Bach stood above the rest. Cioran discovered Bach in his 20s during his years in Bucharest. He listened to Bach in cafes, on borrowed phonographs, anywhere he could find recordings. The experience was immediate and total. Bach's music seemed to come from a place beyond human suffering, a realm of pure structure where chaos was transformed into order. What struck him about Bach was not emotion, but architecture. Bach's music was not trying to express feelings, it was building cathedrals out of sound. The fugues, the counterpoint, the mathematical precision of the structures, these suggested a kind of order that existence itself lacked. In Bach, every note had its place. Every voice entered at the right moment, everything fit together. This was the opposite of Cioran's philosophy. His philosophy said that existence has no order, no structure, no meaning. But Bach's music suggested otherwise. It suggested that order was possible, at least in art, at least temporarily. This contradiction did not trouble Cioran, it consoled him. If order was possible in music, then perhaps existence was not completely hopeless. The Goldberg variations became particularly important to him. He listened to them repeatedly, obsessively. The variations are built on a single bass line that repeats 30 times, with different elaborations each time. The structure is mathematical, almost mechanical, but the effect is transcendent. You hear the same pattern over and over, but each repetition reveals something new. Cioran found this hypnotic. The repetition without monotony, the infinite variation within a fixed structure, this seemed to mirror something essential about existence itself. Life is repetition, the same needs, the same pains, the same thoughts, returning endlessly. But within that repetition, there are variations, small differences that make each moment unique even as it repeats the past. The Mass in B minor was another work he returned to constantly. The Mass is enormous, complex, layered with voices and instruments. It is religious music written for the church. But Cioran, who had no faith, heard something beyond religion in it. He heard human consciousness trying to transcend itself, trying to reach something absolute. The attempt was futile, but it was beautiful. He noticed that Bach's music was impersonal. You cannot hear Bach's personality in the music. You do not know what he felt, what he suffered, what he loved. The music is not about Bach. It is about structure, pattern, mathematical relationships between sounds. This impersonality was what Cioran valued. Personal expression was tiresome. Structure was eternal. Music also provided an escape from language. Cioran spent his life working with words, trying to express thoughts clearly, trying to say what could not be said. Language was always inadequate. Words failed. But music needed no words. It communicated directly below the level of concepts. You did not understand music. You experienced it. This was a relief. For a few minutes while listening, he could stop thinking. The music did not ask him to analyze or interpret. It simply carried him along. His consciousness dissolved into sound. The usual anxieties, the usual obsessions, these faded. What remained was pure perception. But the relief was temporary. The music ended, silence returned, and with silence, consciousness returned, bringing with it all the problems that music had briefly dissolved. This made music both consolation and torture. It proved that transcendence was possible, but it also proved that transcendence did not last. Cioran compared music to mystical experience. Both involved a dissolution of the self, a merging with something larger. Both were intense, overwhelming, brief. Both left you changed and yet unchanged. You had touched something absolute, but you could not stay there. You had to return to ordinary life, ordinary consciousness, ordinary suffering. He also noticed that music made him aware of time in a different way. Music is temporal. It unfolds in time. You cannot grasp it all at once. You have to listen through it moment by moment as it develops. This makes music a meditation on duration, on the passing of time, on the way each moment dissolves into the next. For someone obsessed with time, with mortality, with the weight of duration, this was both painful and beautiful. Music showed him time as structure rather than decay. In a fugue, time is not just loss, it is construction. Each moment builds on the previous moment. The past does not simply disappear, it remains present, audible, woven into the ongoing pattern. This suggested a different way of thinking about existence. Maybe time is not just decay, maybe each moment, however painful, is part of some larger structure that we cannot see because we are inside it. Cioran did not believe this. He thought it was an illusion, but music made the illusion compelling. He rarely went to concerts. He disliked crowds, disliked the ritual of concert going, disliked the social aspect. He preferred to listen alone, on records, in his apartment or in cafes. Listening was private, internal, solitary. It required no one else. This suited him. In Paris, he sometimes attended performances at churches where Bach's sacred music was played. He would sit in the back listening in the darkness. The religious context did not bother him. He ignored the theology and focused on the sound. The church was simply a good acoustic space. He also listened to other composers, Mozart, whom he found too cheerful, too easy, Beethoven, whom he respected but found too emotional, too insistent on personal struggle and triumph, Brahms, whom he appreciated for his melancholy. But none of them affected him the way Bach did. Bach was colder, more impersonal, more absolute. Late in life, when his memory began to fail, he could still listen to music. Even when he could no longer read, no longer write, no longer remember names, he could still respond to Bach. The music reached something deeper than memory, deeper than language, deeper than identity. It was one of the last things to go. This fact struck those who knew him as significant. The man who had spent 70 years thinking, writing, analyzing, ended his life in silence. But before the silence was complete, there was music. It was fitting. Music had been his only reliable consolation, and it remained with him longer than thought. Friendship in Exile, Beckett, Ionesco, and others. Cioran had a reputation as a misanthrope. He wrote about hating humanity, about the burden of other people, about the desire for solitude. But this was not the whole truth. He had friends, deep friendships, friendships that lasted decades. The contradiction was typical of him. The most important of these friendships was with Samuel Beckett. Beckett was Irish, writing in French, living in Paris, as much in exile as Cioran. They met in the early 1950s and remained close until Beckett's death in 1989. They understood each other immediately. Both were writing about failure, about emptiness, about the impossibility of going on. Both were doing it in a language that was not their native tongue. They met regularly in cafes, always the same cafes, always at the same times. They did not talk much. Beckett was even quieter than Cioran. They would sit together in silence, sometimes for an hour, occasionally exchanging a sentence or two. This silence was not awkward. It was companionable. They were two people who understood that most conversation is noise. Beckett's plays and novels explored themes similar to Cioran's essays. Waiting for Godot is about waiting for something that never comes. Endgame is about continuing when continuation is meaningless. The Unnameable is about consciousness trapped in language, unable to stop, unable to say what it needs to say. Cioran read these works and recognized a kindred spirit. But there were differences. Beckett was creating fictions. Cioran was writing philosophy. Beckett's despair was dramatized, placed in the mouths of characters. Cioran's despair was direct, personal, unmediated. Beckett used humor, absurdity, games with language. Cioran was colder, more analytical, but the underlying vision was similar. Existence is suffering. There is no redemption. You continue anyway. Another close friend was Eugene Ionesco, the Romanian French playwright. Ionesco was also in exile, also writing in French, also exploring themes of absurdity and meaninglessness. His plays like The Bald Soprano and Rhinoceros were more theatrical than Beckett's, more obviously comic, but the darkness underneath was the same. Cioran and Ionesco knew each other from Romania. They had both been part of the intellectual scene in Bucharest in the 1930s. They both left Romania and ended up in Paris. This shared background created a bond. They could talk about things that others would not understand. The experience of exile, the guilt of survival, the strangeness of writing in a foreign language. Ionesco was more anxious than Cioran, more openly neurotic. He had panic attacks, nightmares, obsessive fears of death. Cioran listened to these anxieties without judgment. He did not try to reassure. He did not say that things would be fine. He simply acknowledged the fear as reasonable. This acknowledgement was more helpful than reassurance. There was also Mircea Eliade, another Romanian exile, a historian of religion and novelist. Eliade was more successful than Cioran, more integrated into academic life. He held a professorship at the University of Chicago. He published extensively. He was recognized as a major scholar. Cioran had none of this. He lived in obscurity, in poverty, without position or recognition. But the friendship survived these differences. They had known each other since university. They had both been involved in the same intellectual and political circles in Romania. They had both made compromises with the Iron Guard that they later regretted. This shared past, shameful as it was, created a bond that could not be broken. Eliade tried several times to get Cioran an academic position. He wrote letters of recommendation, made introductions, argued for Cioran's brilliance, but nothing came of it. Cioran had no degree, no publications in academic journals, no interest in playing the academic game. He was unemployable. He remained outside the system. The friendship was also intellectual. They argued about religion. Eliade believed that religion revealed something essential about human experience, that myths and rituals expressed archetypal truths. Cioran thought religion was finished, that the sacred had been emptied of content, that modern people were trapped in a post-religious void. They did not convince each other, but they respected each other's positions. Cioran also had French friends. Simone Bou, his partner of nearly 50 years, was the most constant presence in his life. She was not an intellectual, she worked as a philosophy teacher in a lycée. She provided stability, took care of practical matters, gave him space to work. He depended on her completely, though he rarely acknowledged this dependence in his writing. There were also younger writers and intellectuals who sought him out. As his reputation grew in the 1970s and 1980s, students and admirers began to visit. He received them politely but without enthusiasm. He did not like being treated as a guru. He did not want disciples. He answered their questions briefly and sent them away. Some of these visitors recorded their conversations with Cioran. What emerges from these accounts is a man who was warmer in person than in his writing. He laughed. He told stories. He was curious about other people's lives. The coldness of his books was not entirely reflected in his personality. This suggests that the writing was a performance, a deliberate construction, not a simple transcription of his character. But the warmth had limits. He kept people at a distance. He did not form new close friendships after his 50s. The friendships he had were mostly with people he had known for decades. He was loyal but not open. He would see the same people regularly but would not reveal much about himself. The intimacy was real but circumscribed. This pattern makes sense given his philosophy. He believed that other people were burdens, that closeness was dangerous, that you should maintain your solitude. But he also knew that complete isolation was unbearable. The solution was a few carefully chosen friendships maintained over time, deep enough to matter but distant enough to preserve independence. The question of whether Cioran was actually a misanthrope is complicated. He certainly disliked humanity in the abstract. He despised crowds, movements, collective enthusiasms. He had no faith in human progress or human goodness, but he liked specific individuals. He was capable of affection, loyalty, generosity toward friends. The misanthropy was philosophical, not personal. This distinction is important. Many pessimistic philosophers were personally warm. Schopenhauer, despite his philosophy of universal suffering, was known for his charm and wit in conversation. Nietzsche had loyal friends and wrote affectionate letters. Pessimism about existence does not require coldness toward individuals. Cioran understood this. He could believe that life is meaningless and still value friendship. When Beckett died in 1989, Cioran was devastated. He did not attend the funeral. He never attended funerals, but he felt the loss deeply. Beckett had been one of the few people who understood him without explanation. With Beckett gone, Cioran was more alone. He stopped going to cafes regularly. He saw fewer people. The circle contracted. By the early 1990s, as Alzheimer's began to take hold, even the remaining friendships became difficult to maintain. Cioran forgot names, forgot conversations, forgot who people were. The friends who visited found him changed, absent, unreachable. He was there physically but not mentally. The person they had known was disappearing. Simone remained with him until she could no longer manage his care. Then he was moved to a hospital. She visited regularly until his death in 1995. In the end, the misanthrope died, surrounded by medical staff. People paid to care for him. Strangers. The friends were gone. The life had contracted to its final point. The civilized barbarian cultural criticism. Cioran occupied a strange position in relation to Western civilization. He lived in Paris, the cultural capital of Europe. He wrote in French, the language of enlightenment and reason. He read the classics of Western philosophy and literature. He was, by any external measure, a product of Western civilization, and yet he despised it. His critique was not political in the usual sense. He was not arguing for a different economic system or a different form of government. He was attacking something deeper, the entire project of civilization itself, the idea that human life can be organized, improved, perfected through reason and institutions. Civilization, Cioran argued, is a lie. It promises order, but it produces chaos. It promises freedom, but it produces constraint. It promises meaning, but it produces emptiness. The more civilized a society becomes, the further it moves from anything authentic, anything vital, anything real. He contrasted civilization with barbarism, but not in the usual way. Barbarism is usually seen as violence, ignorance, the absence of culture. Cioran reversed this. Barbarians are vital. They have energy, instinct, immediacy. They have not been weakened by too much thought, too much refinement, too much self-consciousness. Civilized people are exhausted, neurotic, incapable of action. This idea had roots in Rousseau, who argued that civilization corrupts natural goodness, that the more civilized we become, the more artificial and unhappy. Cioran agreed with the diagnosis, but not with Rousseau's solution. Rousseau thought we could return to nature, recover simplicity. Cioran thought this was impossible. Civilization is a trap with no exit. Once you are civilized, you cannot become barbaric again. You can only decay. He looked at Western Europe in the mid-20th century and saw exhaustion. 2 world wars had destroyed the continent. The empires were crumbling. The confidence of the 19th century, the belief in progress and reason was gone. What remained was a civilization that no longer believed in itself, that continued out of habit rather than conviction. This exhaustion was visible in art, in literature, in philosophy. Nothing new was being created. Everything was irony, pastiche, quotation. Artists were no longer making things. They were commenting on things already made. This was the sign of a civilization at the end of its life. It had run out of creative energy. All that remained was self-consciousness. Cioran contrasted this with what he called peripheral cultures. Romania was peripheral. The Balkans were peripheral. These were regions that had not fully entered Western modernity. They were backward, poor, violent, but they still had vitality. They still had folklore, superstition, passion. They had not yet been rationalized out of existence. There was nostalgia in this view, but also realism. Cioran knew that peripheral cultures were doomed. Modernity would reach them eventually. They would become civilized, which meant they would become exhausted. The process was inevitable, but for now, they still had something that the West had lost. He also argued that small nations understood something that empires did not. Small nations know they do not matter. They have no grand historical mission. They are not trying to save the world or spread their values. This humility is wisdom. Empires, by contrast, are delusional. They think they are special, chosen, destined, and this delusion makes them dangerous. The United States, for Cioran, was the ultimate expression of civilizational delusion. Americans believed in progress, in optimism, in the future. They believed that technology and democracy would solve all problems. They had no sense of tragedy, no sense of limits. This made them powerful but also stupid. They were barbarians with machines, which was the worst combination. Europe at least had suffered. It had experienced defeat, occupation, genocide. It knew that history was tragic. But America had never been invaded, never been conquered, never learned that confidence is dangerous. American optimism struck Cioran as obscene. He extended this critique to democracy itself. Democracy is based on the idea that the majority is right, that collective decisions are wise. But Cioran saw no evidence for this. Majorities are stupid. Crowds are irrational. Democracy does not produce wisdom. It produces mediocrity. The best people are always in the minority. This position sounds reactionary, and in some ways it was. Cioran had no faith in equality, no faith in popular sovereignty, no faith in the idea that ordinary people should govern themselves. But he also had no alternative. He did not support monarchy or aristocracy. He did not believe in enlightened despotism. He simply thought that all political systems were failures. His ideal, if he had one, was withdrawal. Do not participate in the grand projects of civilization. Do not vote. Do not join movements. Do not believe promises of improvement. Live quietly. Observe from a distance. Refuse to be mobilized. This was not a political program. It was a personal survival strategy. Cioran also criticized Western rationalism. The Enlightenment had promised that reason would liberate humanity, that science would replace superstition, that knowledge would bring happiness. But none of this had happened. Reason had not made people free. Science had not made them happy. Knowledge had made them more anxious, more aware of their mortality, more conscious of the universe's indifference. The rational person, the fully enlightened person, would be paralyzed. They would see that all action is futile, that all values are invented, that there is no ground for anything. Reason destroys the illusions that make life possible. This is why most people are not rational. They cannot afford to be. Civilization also produces a specific kind of suffering. In barbaric societies, suffering comes from hunger, violence, disease. These are real physical sufferings. In civilized societies, suffering is psychological. It comes from boredom, anxiety, meaninglessness. You have food, shelter, safety, but you are still unhappy. In fact, you are more unhappy because you have time to think about your unhappiness. This is the civilized person's dilemma. Material conditions improve, but psychological conditions worsen. The more comfortable life becomes, the more unbearable it feels. Cioran saw this as proof that civilization does not solve human problems. It only transforms them into different problems. Near the end of his life, Cioran watched the Cold War end, watched the Soviet Union collapse, watched the triumph of liberal democracy and capitalism. Intellectuals celebrated this as the end of history, the final victory of the West. Cioran was unmoved. He did not believe in victories. He did not believe the West had won anything. Civilization was still exhausted. The problems were still unsolved. Nothing fundamental had changed. He died in 1995, too early to see the 21st century. But he would not have been surprised by what came next. The same patterns, the same delusions, the same failures. Civilization continues because it cannot stop, but it continues without purpose, without direction, without belief in itself. This was what Cioran had described. The rest was just details. Politics and Betrayal, the Iron Guard years. This is the chapter that Cioran wanted erased, the chapter he refused to discuss, the chapter that contradicts his image as a detached philosopher above politics, but it cannot be ignored. Between roughly 1933 and 1940, Cioran was sympathetic to the Iron Guard, a Romanian fascist movement. He wrote articles and letters expressing support. This is fact, documented, undeniable. The Iron Guard was not simply a political party. It was a mystical nationalist movement that combined Romanian orthodoxy, anti-Semitism, and extreme nationalism. It idealized death, martyrdom, sacrifice. Its members wore green shirts, sang hymns, assassinated politicians. The movement was violent, apocalyptic, convinced that Romania could be purified and regenerated through faith and force. Cioran was in his early 20s when he became involved. He was searching for something absolute, something that would give meaning to his existence and to Romania's place in history. Romania was a small, poor, backward country. It had been on the winning side in World War I, but had gained little. It was culturally marginal, politically unstable, economically weak. Cioran wanted Romania to matter. The Iron Guard promised transformation. It promised that Romania could become great, that it could escape its status as a minor nation. The promise was intoxicating. Cioran wrote articles arguing that Romania needed a spiritual revolution, that democracy was weak, that liberalism was decadent. He used the language of vitality, of energy, of historical destiny. Some of what he wrote was vague enough to be defensible. Criticisms of liberalism, calls for spiritual renewal, these were common among intellectuals in the 1930s. But some of what he wrote was not defensible. He expressed admiration for the Iron Guard's fanaticism. He wrote positively about their violence. He used rhetoric that, if not explicitly anti-Semitic, was compatible with anti-Semitism. The extent of his involvement is debated. He was never a formal member of the Iron Guard. He did not participate in their actions. He did not wear the green shirt or attend their rallies. His involvement was intellectual, not organizational, but this does not excuse it. Ideas have consequences. Words enable actions. By lending intellectual credibility to the movement, Cioran was complicit in what it represented. By 1940, he had already begun to distance himself. He was in Paris. The Iron Guard briefly came to power in Romania in 1940 to 1941. Then was crushed by the military dictatorship of Ion Antonescu. The Guard's members were imprisoned or killed. Romania entered World War II on the Axis side. The Holocaust reached Romania. Hundreds of thousands of Jews were murdered. Cioran watched from Paris. He did not return to Romania. He did not defend the Guard after their fall. He did not write about Romanian politics anymore. He shifted to writing in French, to philosophical rather than political topics. The break was complete and permanent. But he never publicly addressed this past. In interviews, when asked about his early writings, he deflected. He said he had been young, confused, searching. He said everyone made mistakes. He said the 1930s were a time of extremism, and he had been caught up in it. But he did not apologize. He did not explain. He did not analyze what had happened or why. This silence is revealing. Cioran spent his life analyzing everything, exposing everything, refusing all comfortable illusions. But he could not or would not analyze this. The subject was too painful, too shameful. It contradicted everything he later claimed to be. How could someone who saw through all ideologies have fallen for an ideology? How could someone who despised fanaticism have admired fanatics? Some defenders argue that Cioran's involvement was superficial, that he was never truly committed, that he outgrew it quickly. There is some truth to this. His enthusiasm for the Iron Guard lasted only a few years. By his late 20s, he had moved on. The rest of his life, 60 more years, was spent in complete opposition to everything the Guard represented. But this defense is insufficient. The fact that he changed does not erase what he did. The fact that he later rejected nationalism does not undo his earlier nationalism. The fact that he spent decades criticizing ideology does not excuse his brief embrace of ideology. The past remains. Others argue that the experience was formative, that it inoculated him against all future political enthusiasm. Having once been seduced, having once believed in a cause, he would never make that mistake again. His lifelong refusal of politics, his suspicion of all movements, his insistence on remaining outside, these were reactions to his own youthful error. This is more convincing. Cioran's political writings after 1945 are characterized by absolute skepticism toward all political projects. He did not just reject communism and fascism, he rejected democracy, socialism, liberalism, conservatism. He rejected the very idea that political action could improve the world. This total rejection suggests someone who had learned a hard lesson. The Iron Guard years also reveal something about Cioran's psychology. He was drawn to intensity, to extremity, to anything that promised to break through the mediocrity of ordinary life. The Guard offered this. It was passionate, violent, absolute. It demanded total commitment. This appealed to a young man who was desperate for meaning. Later, he found other outlets for this need for intensity. He found it in writing, in the pursuit of perfect style, in the exploration of extreme philosophical positions. But the need remained constant. He was always looking for something absolute, something that would justify existence. The difference was that later he looked for it in thought rather than action, in art rather than politics. The question remains, should Cioran's early political involvement discredit his later philosophical work? Some argue yes. How can we take seriously the philosophy of someone who supported fascism? How can we trust his judgment, his insights, his claims to see through illusions? Others argue no, people change, ideas evolve. A young man's mistakes do not invalidate an old man's wisdom. We should read the philosophy on its own terms, judge it by its content, not by the biography of its author. Both positions have merit. But the question itself may be wrong. Maybe the point is not to decide whether to accept or reject Cioran wholesale, but to read him critically. Aware of his failures, aware that his insights coexist with his blindness. He saw many things clearly, but he was also capable of tremendous error. Both are true. What is certain is that Cioran himself never resolved this. The Iron Guard years remained a wound that never healed. He carried the shame for the rest of his life. It shaped his refusal to participate in anything collective, his insistence on remaining alone, his distrust of his own enthusiasms. He had learned what he was capable of, and he spent the next 60 years making sure he would never do it again. The philosophy of illness. Cioran was sick for most of his life, not with any single disease, but with a collection of chronic ailments that made his body a constant source of suffering. Insomnia was the primary torment, but there were others. Headaches, digestive problems, physical exhaustion, a general sense of malaise that never lifted. His philosophy cannot be separated from this physical reality. Western philosophy has traditionally ignored the body. Philosophers write as if they are pure minds, as if thought happens independently of flesh. Descartes made the separation explicit. Mind and body are different substances. The mind thinks, the body extends in space. The real philosopher concerns himself with the mind. The body is incidental. Cioran rejected this completely. The body is not incidental. The body determines everything. Your thoughts are shaped by your physical state. A headache changes how you think. Exhaustion changes what seems true. Illness reveals aspects of existence that health conceals. He noticed this in his own experience. When he felt physically well, which was rare, existence seemed more bearable. Problems seemed solvable. The future seemed possible. But when he felt ill, which was constant, everything changed. Existence became unbearable, problems became insoluble, the future became a threat. This suggested that philosophical positions are not objective truths, they are expressions of physical states. Optimism is the philosophy of the healthy. Pessimism is the philosophy of the sick. Nietzsche said yes to life because he wrote in brief periods of wellness between devastating migraines. Schopenhauer said no to life because he was chronically ill, anxious, hypochondriacal. Cioran extended this insight. All philosophy is physiological. Descartes' dualism reflects his need to separate mind from body to escape the flesh. Spinoza's monism reflects his calm temperament, his bodily equilibrium. Kant's moral philosophy reflects his rigid daily routine, his obsessive need for control. The body speaks through philosophy, even when philosophy denies the body. This does not mean philosophy is false, it means philosophy is always particular, always rooted in a specific body at a specific time. Universal truths do not exist. There are only local truths, truths for this body and this condition. When the condition changes, the truth changes. Illness also gave Cioran access to experiences that healthy people avoid. When you are healthy, you do not think about your body. It functions automatically, invisibly. You are not aware of your organs, your circulation, your digestion. But when you are sick, the body becomes visible. You feel your heart beating, you notice your breathing, you become aware of processes that are usually unconscious. This awareness is a kind of phenomenological reduction. The body, usually transparent, becomes opaque. You see it from the outside. You realize you are not your body. You are something imprisoned in a body, forced to obey its demands, subject to its failures. Cioran described this as living in a state of permanent crisis. For most people, illness is an interruption. You get sick, you suffer for a while, you recover. But for Cioran, illness was not an interruption. It was the constant state. He never recovered because there was nothing to recover from. This was simply how his body was. This created a strange intimacy with suffering. He knew pain not as an occasional visitor, but as a permanent companion. He knew exhaustion not as a temporary state, but as a baseline. This knowledge gave him authority when he wrote about suffering. He was not imagining it or describing it from a distance. He was reporting from inside it. Illness also taught him about time. When you are healthy, time moves quickly. You are engaged with the world, with projects, with other people. Hours pass without notice. But when you are sick, time slows down. Each minute is felt. You are waiting for the pain to stop, for the exhaustion to lift, for the night to end. Time becomes oppressive, heavy, endless. This experience of time shaped Cioran's philosophy of duration. He wrote about time not as an abstract concept, but as something felt in the body. Time is weight, time is accumulation. Time is the slow crushing of the body under the pressure of its own existence. He also noticed that illness isolates. When you are sick, you cannot participate in normal life. You cannot work, socialize, maintain routines. You are cut off from the world of the healthy. This isolation was familiar to Cioran. Insomnia had already isolated him. Illness reinforced the separation. But isolation had advantages. When you are isolated, you are not distracted. You are forced to confront yourself. You have time to think, to observe, to analyze. Many of Cioran's insights came from this forced solitude. He was not thinking about practical problems or social obligations. He was thinking about existence itself. Illness also made him skeptical of medicine. Doctors could not help him. They had no cure for insomnia, no treatment for his chronic malaise. They offered diagnoses, prescriptions, advice, but nothing worked. This failure taught him that some forms of suffering are simply not fixable. You can analyze them, name them, describe them, but you cannot eliminate them. He extended this skepticism to all promises of cure. Political movements promised to cure social ills, religions promised to cure spiritual ills, philosophies promised to cure existential ills. But Cioran did not believe in cures. He believed in endurance. You do not cure suffering, you live with it. There was also a certain pride in his suffering. He was not healthy, cheerful, productive. He was sick, despairing, barely functional. But this gave him a perspective that healthy people lacked. He had seen something they had not seen. He had experienced depths they had avoided. His illness was a credential, proof that he was qualified to speak about suffering. This pride had a dark side. He sometimes suggested that healthy people were superficial, that their optimism was ignorance, that their productivity was distraction. Only the sick truly understood existence. Only those who suffered had access to truth. This view is elitist and probably false, but it was how Cioran felt. As he aged, the illnesses multiplied. His body, never strong, became weaker. He moved more slowly. He tired more easily. He spent more time in bed, more time in pain. But he did not complain. Complaining about illness requires the belief that health is normal and illness is abnormal. Cioran had no such belief. Illness was normal. The body was always failing. In his 70s, he developed new problems: vision issues, hearing loss, difficulty walking. These were the ordinary decays of aging, but for someone already compromised, they were catastrophic. His world contracted. He could no longer walk for hours through Paris. He could no longer read easily. He could no longer write. The final illness was Alzheimer's. This was different from the physical ailments. This attacked not his body but his mind. His memory dissolved. His ability to form thoughts dissolved. He became, in the end, a body without consciousness. The irony was absolute. The man who hated consciousness, who saw it as a curse, lost it completely. And in losing it, he lost himself. Whether this was liberation or annihilation depends on perspective. From the outside, it looked like annihilation. The person who had been Cioran disappeared. What remained was a body that breathed, ate, slept, but did not think. From the inside, if there was an inside, maybe it was liberation. No more insomnia, no more pain, no more awareness of existence, just silence. The final years, Alzheimer's and silence. In the early 1990s, people close to Cioran began to notice changes. He repeated himself in conversations. He forgot appointments. He seemed confused about time, about where he was, about who people were. At first, these seemed like ordinary signs of aging, but they accelerated. By 1993, the diagnosis was clear: Alzheimer's disease, a progressive neurological condition that destroys memory, cognition, eventually all mental function. There is no cure, there is no treatment. The disease simply advances until the person is gone. For Cioran, this diagnosis was the ultimate irony. He had spent 70 years writing about consciousness as a burden, about the curse of self-awareness, about the desire to escape thought. Now consciousness was being taken from him, but not by choice, not as liberation, as obliteration. The disease began with memory. He forgot recent events first. What he had done yesterday, what he had eaten for breakfast, who had visited. Then the memory loss reached further back. He forgot names of friends. He forgot conversations he had had dozens of times. He forgot his own work, his own books. Simone Bou, his partner, cared for him as long as she could. She reminded him of things. She maintained his routines. She protected him from the confusion that was overtaking him. But the disease progressed. He began to forget who she was. The woman he had lived with for 50 years became a stranger, then a series of strangers, then just a presence. Language went next. He had spent his life working with words, polishing sentences, finding exact expressions. Now words disappeared. He would search for a word and could not find it. He would start a sentence and forget what he was saying. Eventually, he could no longer form coherent sentences at all, just fragments, disconnected words, sounds. The French language, which he had adopted at such cost, which he had worked so hard to master, was the first to go. He reverted to Romanian, the language of his childhood, but even Romanian did not last. Eventually, language itself disappeared. He made sounds, but they meant nothing. Communication became impossible. Those who visited him in these final years found the experience disturbing. This was not the Cioran they had known. The sharp intellect, the precise observations, the cold wit, all of this was gone. What remained was a body that looked like Cioran but did not speak like him, did not think like him, was not him in any meaningful sense. Some wondered if there was still consciousness inside, trapped, unable to express itself. This would be the worst possibility. To be conscious but unable to communicate, to be aware but unable to think clearly, to know that you are disappearing but unable to stop it. But there was no evidence of this. The consciousness seemed simply gone. Others wondered if Cioran had finally achieved what he had always wanted. No more insomnia, because sleep and waking were no longer distinct. No more self-awareness, because there was no self to be aware of. No more suffering, because suffering requires consciousness. Maybe this was peace, but it did not look like peace. It looked like erasure. The disease did not liberate him from consciousness. It destroyed him. There is a difference between choosing to let go of consciousness and having consciousness taken from you. One is liberation, the other is violence. By 1994, Cioran could no longer live at home. He required constant care. He was moved to a hospital. Simone visited regularly, but he did not recognize her. He did not recognize anyone. He sat in a chair or lay in bed, vacant, unreachable. The few people who saw him in this state reported that he seemed calm, even peaceful. There was no agitation, no distress, but there was also no presence. He was not suffering, but only because he was no longer capable of suffering. Suffering requires a subject. The subject was gone. He died on June 20th, 1995, at the age of 84. The cause of death was officially Alzheimer's disease, though the reality was more complex. The disease had destroyed his brain over several years. What killed him at the end was his body's final surrender, the point at which the autonomic systems could no longer maintain themselves. His death was not widely reported. He had lived in obscurity and he died in obscurity. A few obituaries appeared in French newspapers. Some mentioned his books. Most focused on his pessimism, his negativity, his refusal of hope. This was accurate but incomplete. He was more complex than his reputation suggested. He was buried in the Montparnasse cemetery in Paris, in a simple grave. No monument, no elaborate inscription, just his name and dates. This suited him. He had always refused honors, refused recognition, refused anything that would turn him into a public figure. In death as in life, he remained marginal. The funeral was small. Simone attended, along with a few friends and admirers. There was no religious service. Cioran had no faith. There was no eulogy. What would a eulogy say? That he lived, suffered, wrote and died? This was obvious. That he contributed to philosophy? He would have rejected the claim. After his death, interest in his work increased. His books were reprinted, translated into more languages, discussed in academic conferences. He became, ironically, more famous dead than alive. The obscurity he had maintained during his life could not be maintained after his death. The work survived and found its audience, but the work is incomplete without understanding the end. Cioran wrote for 70 years about consciousness, suffering, existence, death. Then consciousness left him, suffering became impossible because there was no one to suffer. Existence became mere biological process. Death came not as release, but as continuation of erasure. This ending complicates his philosophy. He had argued that consciousness is a curse, but when consciousness was taken from him, what remained was not better. It was nothing, an empty body. This suggests that consciousness, however painful, is what makes us human. Without it, we are not liberated, we are simply gone. Or maybe the ending confirms his philosophy. Maybe the erasure was exactly what he had described all along. Existence is a catastrophe. Consciousness makes it unbearable. Death is not liberation, it is annihilation. There is no redemption, no meaning, no hope, just the slow or sudden dissolution of everything you are. The final image of Cioran sitting in a hospital room, vacant and unreachable, is the image his philosophy predicts. This is where consciousness leads, not to enlightenment, not to wisdom, but to breakdown and disappearance. The body outlasts the mind briefly, then follows it into nothing. Cioran and contemporary philosophy. Cioran occupies a strange position in 20th century philosophy. He was not part of any school. He held no academic position. He did not participate in the major debates of his time. He was not cited by other philosophers. And yet his influence was real, if difficult to trace. During his lifetime, academic philosophy was dominated by several major movements. In the Anglo-American world, analytic philosophy focused on language, logic, and the analysis of concepts. In France and Germany, phenomenology and existentialism explored consciousness, being, and human freedom. Cioran belonged to neither tradition. He was not an analytic philosopher. He did not analyze concepts. He did not construct arguments. He did not care about logical rigor or conceptual clarity in the analytic sense. His method was aphoristic, intuitive, literary. Analytic philosophers would have found his work too imprecise, too unsystematic to take seriously. He was closer to the existentialists, at least in subject matter. Like them, he wrote about existence, anxiety, death, freedom, but he rejected the label. Sartre argued that existence precedes essence, that humans are free to create meaning. Cioran thought this was nonsense. Humans are not free, they are trapped. They do not create meaning, they suffer the absence of meaning. Camus wrote about the absurd and the necessity of revolt. Life is meaningless, but we should live with passion and defiance anyway. Cioran found this romantic and false. Why revolt? Against what? For what purpose? The absurd cannot be overcome by attitude. It simply is. Heidegger analyzed being and Dasein and authenticity. Cioran read Heidegger and found him too abstract, too concerned with ontology, too removed from the actual experience of suffering. Heidegger wrote about being toward death. Cioran wrote about insomnia. The difference in concreteness is absolute. But despite his distance from academic philosophy, Cioran influenced certain thinkers. Michel Foucault admired his work. Foucault's later writings on the self, on practices of freedom, on the limits of rationality, show traces of Cioran's influence. Foucault appreciated Cioran's refusal of systems, his skepticism toward Enlightenment narratives, his focus on the body and its constraints. Jacques Derrida never wrote about Cioran directly, but there are affinities. Both were concerned with the limits of language, with the way philosophical texts undermine their own claims, with the impossibility of presence. Derrida's deconstruction was systematic and rigorous. Cioran's was intuitive and fragmentary. But both arrived at similar conclusions about the instability of meaning. Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari, in their critiques of psychoanalysis and capitalism, occasionally referenced Cioran. They appreciated his attacks on progress, his refusal of dialectical thinking, his insistence that philosophy should be a practice of life rather than an academic discipline. In the Anglo-American world, Cioran was largely ignored. Analytic philosophers did not know what to do with him. He did not fit their categories. He did not write in their style. He made no arguments they could evaluate. But among literary critics and cultural theorists, he found some audience. Susan Sontag wrote about him, comparing him to other aphorists and moralists. She appreciated his precision, his refusal to console, his commitment to clarity. Harold Bloom included him in discussions of influence and literary anxiety. George Steiner referenced him in essays on tragedy and the death of culture. But Cioran's real influence was not academic. It was among readers, especially young readers, who found in his work something they could not find elsewhere. Students read him in dorm rooms. Writers read him for his style. Depressives read him for his honesty about suffering. He became a cult figure, someone you discovered and shared with a few select friends. This cult status had advantages and disadvantages. The advantage was that his work reached people directly, without institutional mediation. You did not need a professor to explain Cioran. You could read him yourself and understand him immediately. The disadvantage was that he was taken less seriously by the academic establishment. Cult figures are not respectable. His position outside academia also meant he was free from academic fashions. He did not have to respond to critics. He did not have to defend his positions against objections. He did not have to publish in journals or attend conferences. He could write exactly what he wanted, in exactly the style he wanted. This freedom is visible in his work. There is no jargon, no citations, no engagement with scholarly debates. Each book stands alone. You can read any of his books without having read the others. You can read him without having read anyone else. This accessibility is rare in philosophy, but it also limited his influence. Philosophers take seriously the philosophers who engage with philosophy as a discipline. Cioran did not engage. He wrote from the outside, as a critic, as an observer. This made him interesting but marginal. In recent decades, interest in Cioran has grown, more translations have appeared, more critical studies have been published, conferences have been held, a small industry of Cioran scholarship has emerged. But this scholarship faces a problem. How do you write academically about someone who rejected academic writing? Most scholarly work on Cioran focuses on placing him in context. Comparisons with Nietzsche, Schopenhauer, the existentialists, analysis of his influences and sources, biographical studies. This work is useful, but it misses something essential. Cioran was not trying to contribute to philosophy. He was trying to survive. The contemporary relevance of Cioran is unclear. We live in a time of increasing pessimism about the future. Climate change, political instability, technological disruption, these have created a mood of anxiety and despair. Cioran seems newly relevant. His refusal of optimism, his skepticism toward progress, his focus on suffering, these resonate. But Cioran offers no solutions. He does not tell you what to do about climate change. He does not propose political strategies. He does not offer hope. If you read him looking for answers, you will be disappointed. What he offers is description. This is what existence is. This is what consciousness feels like. This is what it means to be alive in time. Whether this is valuable depends on what you need. If you need hope, Cioran is not helpful. If you need intellectual honesty, if you need someone who will not lie to you about the human condition, then Cioran is essential. He tells the truth as he saw it. The truth is dark, but it is truth. The practice of pessimism, living with Cioran. The question most readers eventually ask is, how do you live with Cioran? If you accept his philosophy, if you agree that existence is suffering and consciousness is a curse and meaning is absent, how do you continue? What does a Cioranian life look like? Cioran himself provided one model. He lived quietly in Paris for 50 years. He wrote in cafes. He walked through the city. He read, listened to music, saw a few friends. He avoided institutions, avoided commitments, avoided anything that required him to believe in the future. This was a life of deliberate marginality, of refusal, of minimal participation. But most people cannot live this way. Most people have jobs, families, obligations. They cannot simply withdraw. They have to participate in the world, even if they believe the world is absurd. So the question remains, how do you reconcile Cioran's philosophy with ordinary life? One answer is that you do not. You read Cioran, you recognize the truth of what he says, and then you put the book down and continue with your life. The philosophy is not meant to be lived, it is meant to be acknowledged. You know that everything is meaningless, but you act as if it is not. This is not dishonesty, this is survival. This approach treats Cioran as a kind of intellectual hygiene. Reading him clears away illusions, false hopes, comforting lies. You see existence more clearly. But then you step back. You cannot live in that clarity constantly. It would paralyze you. So you allow yourself a certain amount of illusion, a certain amount of hope, not because you believe in it, but because you need it. Another answer is that Cioran's pessimism can actually be liberating. If nothing matters, then nothing you do can be a mistake. If there is no meaning, then you are free to create your own meaning, however temporary, however arbitrary. This sounds like existentialism, and in a way it is, but the difference is that Cioran does not claim that your created meaning is real. It is just something you do to pass the time. This liberation through pessimism has appeal. Many readers report that Cioran actually made them happier, not because his philosophy is happy, but because it removed pressure. If existence is meaningless, then you do not have to achieve great things. You do not have to save the world. You do not have to live up to anyone's expectations. You can just exist, modestly, without grand ambitions. A third answer is that Cioran's philosophy teaches a kind of honesty. Most people lie to themselves constantly. They pretend they will live forever. They pretend their work matters. They pretend they are special. Cioran removes these pretenses. You will die. Your work will be forgotten. You are ordinary. Accepting this is painful but also clarifying. This honesty can improve relationships. If you stop pretending, if you acknowledge limitations, if you accept that everyone is suffering and no one has answers, you can be more generous. You do not judge people for their failures because you know that failure is universal. You do not expect perfection because you know perfection is impossible. But there are dangers in living with Cioran. The first is paralysis. If nothing matters, why do anything? Some readers find that Cioran's philosophy removes motivation. They stop working, stop creating, stop engaging with the world. They sink into passivity, into depression, into inaction. This is not Cioran's fault, but it is a risk. The second danger is misanthropy. Cioran wrote about hating humanity, about finding other people unbearable. Some readers take this as permission to withdraw completely, to become bitter, to justify their own isolation. But Cioran himself had friends. He was capable of warmth. His misanthropy was philosophical, not personal. Readers who use his philosophy to justify cruelty or contempt have misunderstood. The third danger is nihilism in the destructive sense. If nothing matters, why not destroy? Why not harm? Why follow any ethical constraints? Cioran never advocated this. He was not violent. He did not harm others. His nihilism was passive, contemplative. But some readers might take it in a more active direction. The question of ethics in Cioran is interesting. He wrote very little about morality directly. He did not propose ethical systems. He did not argue about right and wrong. But his writing assumes certain values. Honesty is better than dishonesty. Clarity is better than confusion. Suffering should be acknowledged, not denied. These are minimal ethics, but they are ethics. Another practical question: can you raise children with Cioran's philosophy? The answer is almost certainly no. Children need hope. They need to believe the future can be better. They need encouragement, optimism, support. Telling a child that existence is meaningless would be cruel. So parents who read Cioran must keep the philosophy to themselves. But maybe this is the point. Cioran's philosophy is for adults who have already lost their illusions. It is not for children. It is not even for most adults. It is for people who have reached a certain point of exhaustion, a certain level of disillusionment, where the usual consolations no longer work. For these people, Cioran is valuable, not because he offers solutions, but because he offers companionship. When you read him, you realize you are not alone. Someone else has felt what you feel. Someone else has thought what you think. Someone else has seen through the lies. This recognition is consoling, even though the content is not. The practice of pessimism, then, is not a set of rules or guidelines. It is an attitude. You do not expect much. You do not believe promises. You do not trust grand narratives. You remain skeptical, detached, aware. But you continue. You do what needs to be done. You take care of responsibilities. You show up. This is not heroism. This is not even virtue. It is just persistence. You keep going, not because life is meaningful, but because stopping requires more effort than continuing. This is the minimal ethics of pessimism. Do not cause unnecessary suffering. Do not lie about existence. Acknowledge the horror and keep going anyway. Cioran himself exemplified this. He suffered constantly. He saw no meaning in existence. He had no hope for the future. But he kept writing. He kept revising. He kept perfecting his sentences. Why? Not because writing would change anything, but because it was something to do. It was better than nothing. This perhaps is the final lesson. Pessimism does not require passivity. You can acknowledge meaninglessness and still act. You can see through illusions and still create. You can accept that nothing matters and still care about the quality of what you do. The contradiction is not a problem, it is simply the human condition. The Insomniac's legacy. Cioran died in 1995. Nearly 30 years have passed. His books remain in print. New translations appear. Readers continue to discover him. What is his legacy? In academic philosophy, he remains marginal. He is not taught in most philosophy departments. He is not included in standard histories of 20th century thought. When he is mentioned, it is usually in passing, as a footnote, as someone interesting but not important. This marginality was probably inevitable. He did not write for philosophers, he wrote for readers. In literature, his position is stronger. He is recognized as a master stylist, as someone who achieved perfection in the aphoristic form. Writers study him for his technique, for his precision, for his ability to compress complex thoughts into single sentences. He belongs to the tradition of French moralists, and that tradition values him. Among general readers, especially young readers, he continues to find an audience. Each generation discovers him anew. Students read him in late-night existential crises. Writers read him when they are blocked. Depressives read him when nothing else resonates. He has become one of those writers who speaks to a certain mood, a certain state of mind. His influence is difficult to measure because it is diffuse. There are no Cioranians, there is no Cioran school. No one builds on his work in the way philosophers build on each other's work, but traces of his thinking appear in unexpected places. In novels, in essays, in songs, in films, his voice echoes. Part of his legacy is stylistic. He showed that philosophical writing does not have to be academic, does not have to be systematic, does not have to be boring. You can write philosophy in clear, beautiful, compressed sentences. You can address serious questions without jargon. This lesson has influenced writers who want to combine thought and art. Another part of his legacy is his refusal. He refused academic positions. He refused honors. He refused to participate in the cultural machinery that turns writers into celebrities. He remained outside, marginal, independent. This refusal is itself a position, a statement about how to live as a writer in late modernity. His pessimism also has legacy value. In an age of mandatory optimism, of forced cheerfulness, of relentless positivity, Cioran offers permission to be negative. He legitimizes despair. He says that if you find existence unbearable, you are not wrong. You are just seeing clearly. This permission is valuable to people who feel pressure to pretend everything is fine. But his legacy is complicated by his early political involvement. The Iron Guard years cannot be forgotten. They are part of his biography, part of his record. Some readers reject him entirely because of this. Others try to separate the early writings from the later work. Others read the later work as a lifelong attempt to atone for the early mistakes. The question of how to read a writer with a compromised past is not unique to Cioran. Heidegger joined the Nazi Party. Paul de Man wrote anti-Semitic articles. Ezra Pound supported fascism. In each case, we face the same problem. Can we separate the work from the life? Should we? There is no simple answer, but with Cioran, the later work explicitly rejects everything the early work embraced. He spent 50 years criticizing nationalism, ideology, fanaticism, political enthusiasm. This does not erase the past, but it suggests genuine change. The question is whether we credit that change or whether past sins are unforgivable. His legacy also includes his failures. He never achieved what he wanted. He wanted to write a perfect book, a book where every sentence was necessary and true. He never wrote that book. He wanted to escape consciousness, to find peace. He never found it. He wanted to understand why he was born. He never understood. These failures are part of the legacy because they are honest. Cioran did not pretend to have succeeded. He did not claim to have solved existence. He simply recorded his failure. And that record is valuable precisely because it is a record of failure. Success is easy to admire but hard to learn from. Failure teaches more. His legacy is also his voice. The cold, precise, unforgiving voice that speaks from his pages. That voice is unique. No one else sounds like Cioran. Once you have heard it, you recognize it immediately. It is the voice of 3 in the morning, of someone who has been awake too long, of someone who has seen too much. That voice continues to speak to people who are awake at 3 in the morning, who have seen too much, who cannot believe the comforting stories anymore. For those people, Cioran is not a philosopher or a writer. He is a companion, someone who knows what you know, someone who has been where you are. The final legacy is the question he leaves unanswered. Why continue? If existence is what he says it is, if there is no meaning, no hope, no redemption, why not end it? He thought about this question for 70 years. He never found an answer. He just continued. Maybe the continuation itself is the answer. Not a logical answer, not a philosophical answer, but an existential answer. You continue because you continue. There is no reason. There is just a fact. And in that fact, however bleak, however meaningless, there is something, not much, but something